we were supposed to start at 10 a.m., but we were talking so much off the air, so to
Yeah,
speak, that I know.
that
So we have
happens.
to. I know because I could talk to you. I could tell I could talk to you for hours, but let's.
I don't
Okay,
know if
so
I
I.
could do the Ron Gleason marathon that you had, but that I don't know. I don't think I could beat that one.
I know that was. Yeah, I mean the only longer one I did was with John Suntress, and that was 3 hours.
Wow, wow.
Yeah, because he and I kept having these 2 hour phone conversations, and I said, why don't we just do a live stream sometime? So
Did you have intermission as well? You know,
no,
everybody can get up and go take a bathroom break, come back, get some coffee.
right, yeah. But so I yeah, Ron Gleason, I was surprised he talked that long, but I kept thinking, okay, I'm just gonna keep asking him stuff. I guess because he has a long history and
Oh yeah.
I don't think anybody had interviewed him at length. So
Yeah, that was a
but
good one. That was a good one, and what a great guy to talk to. I mean, a legend in Chicago news and Chicago sports, and
yeah,
an amazing guy as well.
yeah.
Fascinating to listen to that.
No, so I talked to you 9 years ago and it was at a radio station, and I
I
know it's a
can't
long time
believe it's
ago.
been 9 years already.
I know,
Where
and
does the time go?
you were very yeah, very nice to and let me go there. But I well, I mean, gosh, I mean, what have you been doing? Well, let's just go back into your history because it was a long time ago. But what you first of all, you have a great broadcasting voice, and I'm just wondering how you got into radio.
I got into radio because I wanted to be an architect. So I grew up on the north side of the city and was always aware of what a wonderful skyline that we have here and a wonderful city. And of course, that is the same to this day. And I love to work with my Lego blocks, and I would build my skyscrapers. You know how they always have build a plane or build a submarine, or no, I just built my own stuff. So that's how I did that. And I was also interested in drawing. I used to draw when I was a kid, and I still do now. I haven't done it as much as I've used to. So I figured, oh, well, architecture and drawing, and that makes sense. And so I went to, when I was in high school, I took some drafting classes, and I really enjoyed them. And the drafting teacher said, your design ideas are fantastic, but these houses will never hold up. Yeah, this beam does not match this post in the right spot. Math was never my strong suit, but design was always interesting to me. So I realized that I always enjoyed the design. So it's like, well, what else is it that I really enjoy? And that's music and listening to the radio. And when we moved from the city to the suburbs, most of my friends were still back where they were, and we're talking the late 70s and early 80s. It's not like today where everybody's so connected all the time. And I realized that the friends that did come with me were the ones that were on the radio, Larry Lujak and Tommy Edwards and Jeff Davis and people like that, since I listened to WLS mainly. And I realized that that's what I wanted to get into. And like so many other broadcasters, we had a home station. We played radio. So my friends and I would play radio. And I was the only one to end up going into the business. So one became a doctor, one went into advertising, one went into computers, and I was the one that ended up going into broadcasting.
Hmm. Well, then, what did you like about radio so much?
Other than the music, obviously, I'm a music aficionado. I love everything from, whatever's popular to classic rock. I like jazz. I also have a real affinity for our local bands that we have in the area. In fact, just the other night, I saw my friends off Broadway, who I've introduced once again. I think I've been introducing those guys for 25 years already. They did the song Stay in Time and Full Moon Turn my head around back in 1980s, the early 80s. Um, so music was always very important. When I was in high school playing our home radio station, I would go out and buy 45s every week. Well, I would take my lunch money and I would decide that day, well, am I going to have lunch or am I going to go buy a new record? So pretty much just about any song from the 80s, I can pretty much tell you the label that it was on, because where my
Wow.
school was, we had record stores close by. We actually had Sears close by, which still sold records back in those days. And they also had the music radio survey there. So it was kind of two for one. I would go and grab my survey And then I grabbed some records as well. And then that was one of the reasons. But the second half of that is the personalities. It really is. It's the connection that you have with the people that are on the air, that are speaking just to you. You know, as I mentioned, people like Bob Surratt and Fred Winston, Larry Lujak, so on and so forth, and other stations as well, Mitch Michaels, and so many others that were just fantastic people on the air. And they were able to speak to you. And I said, no, that might be something fun. And since I enjoyed talking and I enjoyed music, I thought, yeah, maybe that's the way to go. So that's how I ended up getting into that.
So what did you like about Larry Lujak? I mean, unfortunately he's not alive right now, but I mean anymore, but I know he was a legend. And for people who don't know who he was, what made him so special?
Because he wasn't the regular disc jockey that was, hey, it's 15 after 7, 7:15. We got some great music coming up this hour. Hope you enjoy that. I want to say hi to Jim. He's listening to Schomburg right now, and here's the latest for you. He was not that kind of a disc jockey. And in the morning, uh, he was caustic and he was like everybody else. Think about how we sound when we get up in the morning, you know? The conversation between your loved one may not be that much. I know my wife and I don't talk that much in the morning. And Lair was kind of the same way. He was just straight ahead. 15 after 7, WLS, Larry Lujak, and the cheap, trashy showbiz report coming up. And he was just very matter of fact. And that still made him entertaining because when you would hear his features such as Animal Stories or Cheap Trashy Showbiz Report or whatever it was, they were interesting because of how Larry was not your um, typical, putting on a show type of thing. And meeting him many times, that Lair was Lair. That's the way he was. But that's what he did, and that's how he did it. Whereas you listen to other jocks, like you said, let's say John Records Landecker, who amazing talent again, and he was up against so much competition at night and came up with different ways to make the show interesting. And he's a wordsmith as well. So he loves words. He loves writing. He comes from a family where his father was worked at a university. So everyone had a little different flair, different flavor, and that made it interesting as well because not everybody sounded the same. So as you listen to it, you go, "Oh, I like what he does. I like what he does." And then you get to Fred Winston, who is Gary Deeb, the reporter for the Chicago newspapers, once said that he graduated from the Burp and Fart School of Broadcasting. So he was kind of like the kid or the little brother that you would have that always tried to get away with something and would tell the joke that maybe is not the cleanest, but you have to work at it to figure out what he's talking about, and that's the great thing about Fred as well. And I feel fortunate for so many of these people that I had an opportunity to work with them as well.
Yeah, so what was that like? So John Records Landecker, I did interview him for this podcast a while ago. But what were the other guys like? What was Larry Lujak like and Fred Winston, etc.?
Lair was always very quiet, but to talk to other people that worked with him at length, he cared about his job. He was there a long time, but he also cared about playing golf. And he was one of those that didn't like recognition. He didn't want to be, if he got the the top disc jockey award of the year or something like that, he wasn't interested in any of that stuff. But he did care about his coworkers, and he was one of those that would do that kind of on the down low. So whereas talking about like say Tommy Edwards, here's somebody who worked with Larry for many years. And Tommy, I got to know from just first of all, just standing outside the studio back in those days when you could stand out there all day and just watch all the air personalities on the air. And I loved his style and his one-on-one, the way he was a broadcaster, but that's how he was in person as well. And I can remember when I was at school at Columbia College. So I went to Columbia College, Chicago as well. And he came in as a speaker at one point, and he was talking and doing his presentation. And they got to the Q&A at the end, and I think I asked a question, and he just looked at me, pointed, he goes, "I know who you are." So, but he was one of those that I really relied on as far as coming up with my style because I don't always do the wacky jokes. I'm not a Howard Stern type or Man Cow where it's more shock humor. And it's just kind of being relatable and one on one. And he and Jeff Davis, who is another one of my mentors and also still with us at WLS as the voice of WLS and one of the historians as well. We all work together on keeping the WLS history together. I had that same style. And that's kind of what I latched onto.
Well, yeah, so I was gonna say that I was looking at Tommy Edwards, but I was gonna say that Jeff Davis is the voice of my podcast, and he's a guy who's in the middle liner, and I did meet him in LA, and I went to his place and I interviewed him there, and he's totally into radio. I'd love to do an update with him.
Yeah, you
But
should.
see, yeah, so what you did touch upon your style. How would you say that your style is?
Just kind of, I've always used the term on the air, Radio Pal. Hey, it's Radio Pal Scott Childers, because that's kind of how I feel. Like I'm there to hang out with you, whether it be for 4 or 5 hours or whatever. If I'm out doing a remote, I'm just there to hang out. I don't believe in the star status. I just want to be there with the music at the same time, or well, certainly now, working at WLS and doing some talk programming. That is so different than doing music programming. So there's a lot more preparation, as you know, and you do a lot of talking. And it's funny because music jocks, they always wanted a little more extra time. Oh, can I get 30 seconds more? Can I get a minute more? And then when you switch over to talk radio, you have more time than you need. So you have to really time management is so important, and also preparation. And I'll say of the times when the first time I started doing talk programming, that was at WJOL in Joliet, and I didn't have any producers. I had Monica DeSantis, who was in the newsroom to help out as far as bouncing off of, but it was all preparation and so much different, and you don't have 3.5 minutes in between. So definitely a different animal there, but and one that is constantly evolving as well. But yeah, so that I think that's how it is. And I look at somebody like Lynn Bramer. I didn't know Lynn personally, but when you think about how his style was, he wasn't over the top. He just kind of hung out with you, and I kind of follow that same kind of format.
But I was gonna say about talk programs. See, one thing I notice is I love talk radio. I think it's extremely hard to do. Not a lot of people can do it. I mean, John Williams, I think, is one of the best in our
Yeah,
city. But one thing I notice is that when music people go to talk, they sometimes they rely on the listeners. They rely on the calls, and then they'll just put whoever on. Or if they don't get the calls, they sometimes their prep doesn't run so deep, because if you're talking about current events or something, you have to be able to reference, you have to have a point of view, and I think that's extremely hard.
it is very hard. Yeah, and I can see why that is the case because when you think of music jocks, certainly back in the heyday, we were very reliant on phone calls and we'd get them both on and off the air. And that was a way to connect with the listener. That's how they used to call it telephone talk back in the early days at WGN when they went from music to talk, or the old WIND was telephone talk. When Clark Weber moved from being a music jock to WIND, he had what they called it a telephone talk show, because he would put a subject out there and then rely on the listeners to be a part of the show. Whereas nowadays that's changed a lot, just because listeners don't have as much time to call in anymore. Now we have, you can use a text line or people will email. I've noticed filling in at WLS. I mean, a lot of that comes in electronically now. People don't have time to call and they don't have time to sit on hold. So you're absolutely right. And the best talk hosts are the ones that can not only fill that time, but also fill it with something that's important. Because sure, it's easy to talk for 40 minutes, but you got to make sure that it's something that's valuable. And that it is difficult. I am learning that process.
Okay, so how did you learn how to? I mean, when was the last time you actually? I've heard you fill in on WLS. That's what made me think of interviewing you again. But when did you, after WJOL, did you do talk radio?
So when I was at Star 96.7 and WJOL, and the 95.9, the river as well. So all part of the same Alpha Media cluster. So I was there for just about 20 years. And about 5 years ago, we had a budget reduction and I was reduced to part-time status and I stayed on to help fill in. So that's when I ended up starting to do some work for Scott Slocum at WJOL. And the first few shows I did were afternoon shows for our afternoon host at the time, and I made sure that I loaded up with guests. So I brought a lot of people in that I knew because then I figured it's going to be a lot easier.
Yeah.
I listened for many, many years to Kevin Matthews and just the amazing talent he was at AM 1000 and The Loop, and how he could bring in characters and do so much. I don't have all of those skills. I have some of them, but I don't, you don't know how well they're going to work. And so I just try to play it straight. So I brought in as many people as I could. When I started to fill in the morning show, people didn't want to get up at 5 in the morning to come in. So I had to be more reliant on myself. So that's what I did through the period of filling in. And then I was brought back in full time in the engineering department, believe it or not. So I worked on the maintenance of all five of our radio stations, making sure that they stayed on the air. Everything from helping staffers with computer issues to problems with transmitters and microphones and studios and out at the site, and also being in charge of maintenance, which involved having um, various trades come out, whether it was HVAC people that had to come out to maintain the equipment at the site. And that went for 5 years. And then we ended up going through a budget cut again. And so in February, that was it for me there. And thanks to my great program director and friend, Stephanie Tishner at WLS, she brought me back in right away to do some fill-in work, and that's what I've been doing. And that included doing some afternoon fill-in, doing the talk show there, and then most recently filling in for Ray Stevens for a week. And like I said, it's definitely different than sitting there playing music, but it's exciting to do. And once you start to get the hang of it, it's a little easier. I won't say I have the complete hang of it yet, but I have a pretty good idea. So, as you mentioned, people like John Williams, and you look at talk hosts that have been on the air for years and years and years, and they make it look so easy. But when you look behind the scenes, there's a lot of work, and there's people there to help them to make sure it's.
Yeah, but I think from the host perspective, I think what makes it work is it's all, of course, it's all the prep and it's all, lining up the guests and so forth. But I think it's when somebody decides who they are. Like, I'm going to be this on the air, I'm going to take this angle, and then they stick with it, or they fulfill that kind of role. And then when you listen, you can really hear their point of view, whether even if they're not really political, it's their personality on the air. And I really wish there were more people who are working on that craft to the John Williams level. He had many years working on that.
And you're absolutely right, because when you look at various stations, they fill various needs. So in the case of WGN, it's always been an all-encompassing radio station. And when you look at, say, WLS now, WLS is very conservative. So when you're on the air and doing a show, you don't have to go full Rush Limbaugh, but obviously you follow that path. And broadcasters have always been taught, especially in working in music radio, that you stay right down the center. You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
so it's kind of tough to sometimes have to tread out on that ice when you're not used to doing that all the time. And in fact, in our case, because I generally am in the newsroom and work doing news updates for the station, where we do stay in the center. So there we stay in the center, but if you're going into the talk studio, then you're going to kind of lean more to the conservative side, or vice versa. Let's say you're on a station like WCPT where your news is going to be in the center, but then your talk hosts are going to have more of a progressive angle to it. So, and that is a craft to learn as well. And that one's
Yeah.
difficult, especially for some of us who've been at it for so long, where we've really been taught to stay right in the middle. And you don't need to divulge those type of things on the air because people, if you're listening to a music station, probably don't care very much about that. And you know, so that is a bit of thin ice there to walk on.
Yeah, because you don't want to betray the listeners. I mean, if somebody's filling in and they're putting out certain ideas, the listeners will call and they'll say, "What's up with this guy?" Or they'll text in like, "What's going on?" Um, but I still think there's a way. I think it depends because I have heard some people on WLS, national people, and I think okay, they've got a certain angle, but the angle doesn't run as deep. And Rush Limbaugh, have you ever met Rush Limbaugh?
I've never met him, but I did news and traffic during his show for many years on WLS back in the mid to late '90s. So we had
Oh, okay.
we
Oh
had an
wow, that's a
interesting.
heyday.
It was that's when there was a very interesting lineup on the station because the morning started with Don Wade and Roma. Um, talk about a
Incredible
fantastic.
broadcasters.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about a fantastic duo, and Don just so creative, so creative, even back into his music radio days and when he was at US 99. And he was really the only one. Him and Roma were the only ones that really made the transition over from music to talk, with the exception of a couple people in the newsroom. Catherine Johns also had a talk show. Tom Johnson, who was a producer and a part timer, he did some talk work over there during the early days, right after the station flipped in 1989. But when I was there, so yeah, you had Don and Roma in the morning. Then you had Dr. Laura for an hour or so, 2 hours with Dr. Laura. Then Rush started at
Wait, sorry.
11.
Can you explain Dr. Laura because probably a lot of people don't know who she is.
Dr. Laura Schlesinger was a therapist, so it was a call-in therapy show, and you would tell her your problems or your issues, your family, social, so on and so forth, and then she would opine on that and give you some advice. So Dr. Laura had she ran hot and cold. She had her people that were behind her, and she had her detractors as well. So, and I think she did TV as well. I think she did a TV show. So you had
Yeah.
2 hours of that from 9 to 11, then 11 to 2. You had Rush Limbaugh, and then you had another hour of Dr. Laura, and then you had Rokan and Gary Meyer in the afternoon. So it was quite an interesting schedule and lineup that we had in the mid '90s there, and I did news and traffic reports during the middle of the day. So I was on during Dr. Laura and a little bit of Rush Limbaugh as well.
That's an amazing lineup because they all those people that you mentioned were incredible broadcasters. And back then WLS was not necessarily one way. And it was really exciting. I think maybe that might have been the heyday of talk radio. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
There was a lot
it
going on.
was, I think so. I mean, a lot of people, if you look into the history of talk radio, it's changed quite a bit. I mean, as we had mentioned earlier, telephone talk of the 70s and into the early 80s was very big. And then when you look at a bellwether event like WABC in New York, which was kind of the WLS of New York, though some would argue that WLS was the WABC of Chicago. But either way, a huge top 40 radio station throughout the 60s and 70s, and they flipped to talk radio in 1982. So very, very early, as opposed to, say, WLS, which did not switch from music to talk until 1989. And in those early days, they would have local talk shows on, very similar to what we would hear on WGN. But then you'd also have a gardening show, or you'd have an entertainment show, or you'd have a show about cars and sports show before all sports became an actual format. So it was kind of a mixed bag in those days, where I think nowadays you look at it and a lot of talk radio stations have really kind of honed in on their specific format like a music station would. So for example, you look at, as we mentioned, WLS is very conservative, whereas WCPT is more progressive, a progressive station. And then you look at, say, WIND, which is very, very conservative. So they've all kind of found their niche as far as that's concerned, whereas a station like WGN kind of still follows in the middle. And really, when you think about it, there's not many like that anymore. And it's good to still have them around for that reason because I worked for many years on WGN on Sunday mornings with Dean Richards, and what a fun show we had there. It was Rob Hart, and he was in the newsroom, and I did traffic, and we had a great time, and it was just super fun. We just had fun with it, and the listeners enjoyed that, and and it's Sunday morning. You're not looking at getting into heavy topics at that point. There's a lot of entertainment report, and we kind of just went from there. And I look back at those. That was probably some of the earliest where I would have done quote unquote talk, because even though I was the traffic reporter, we were given a lot more chance to talk and be a part of the show, which was definitely fun.
And also, Dean is a broadcasting pro, and so is Rob. They're at different
Yes.
stations now, but I mean, Dean's still at WGN and Rob is at WBBM, but I'm sure it was a plus show because
It,
they really
it was a
know.
blast. It was a hoot. We had so much fun. And a lot of times, I mean, Rob's over in the newsroom and I was over at the traffic center. So I wasn't always on site. And still, even with the three of us in three different locations, we still made it work, and it worked so well. It was so much fun. I think I did that show for about 6 years or so. So it was great fun to work with both of them. Total pros and
Yeah.
an awesome experience. If you got to get up on a Sunday morning, at least you're getting up and doing something that was super fun.
Yeah, so when you say radio is fun, because I know what you're talking about from experience, but how do you describe radio fun to people? Because now people they consume audio so differently now.
Yeah, I think it's like everything else. I think everyone's idea of fun is different, and whether it's talking up a song, which I still find fun, to being able to have that ultimate guest that you always want if you're working talk radio, or even most recently in the newsroom, I was fortunate enough to cover both the RNC and the DNC for not only WLS, but for Cumulus stations in Dallas and in Colorado Springs. And it is an experience that I had never had before. I've never been to a national convention. And since we had the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee and then DNC here in Chicago, I covered both. We also had one of our other reporters, Jonathan Bregman, who covered as well. So for the both of us, and Jonathan is much younger than I am. He's just getting his career started, whereas I've been at it a couple of years here and there. It was pretty amazing because I had no idea what to expect, and it was. I will say there was parts that were fun. Waiting an hour to get into the United Center, not so fun, but it's part of the experience. And being on the news side, as you know, that becomes a story in itself. So you never know where your story is going to come from. You think, oh, well, I'm going to cover, whoever is here, whether it's JD Vance or Donald Trump or the delegates and so on and so forth. Whereas you do not expect that not being able to get in for an hour becomes the story, and it did. So yes, so there was some fun in doing that as well, and it was just a great experience to do.
Why was there such a delay at the United Center?
From what we understand, there were not enough people they did have TSA to get everyone in. So you had all the buses that were coming in, the shuttle buses coming into the protected zone, and everyone had to get off these buses. They came from just about every downtown hotel. And then just imagine being at the airport and trying to get through TSA. And it was the same thing, that it was very, very difficult. I understand it was either the first or the second day. And I was not working at the UC those days. I was working at the delegate breakfast and at McCormick Place for the first 2 days. But that, yes, that hour, it was almost 2 hours at some point to try to get into the UC because they only had one entrance in, and that was it. Whereas in Milwaukee, it was set up differently. It was Fiserv Forum, but they had several entrances. Plus, at that point, you were already into the protected area, so you had a little more room to move around because everything is a little more compact as opposed to how it was at the United Center. So it was more of a logistics thing. And then the last night when Kamala Harris was speaking, they actually had to close down the floor, the main floor, because it was overcrowded. the fire marshal had actually closed down the entrances to get to the floor. You had to be badged. You have to be badged for everything. You have to be badged to get into the protected zone. You have to be badged to get into the building. You have to be badged if you're on the floor. It does not matter. You have a badge for everything on top of a Secret Service badge. So, but apparently it got to the point where they weren't even letting people out because they didn't want to let other people in. And I talked to a couple of the delegates, one woman who is a Wisconsin delegate, and she said, I just needed to go to the bathroom. And I told them, I've got to go. And they let her out. And then she was going to go back in. The usher let her back in. But a supervisor then was going to kind of yell at the usher saying, listen, this was the policy. And the delegate told the supervisor, listen, and I forgot what how old she was. She was probably in her 60s or 70s. And she says, when you get to this age, you'll understand when you got to go, you got to go. My things are still inside. I'm going back in. So it was really something else. There was some mild chaos here and there.
Hmm. So what kind of stories did you do from the conventions?
So what we mainly covered in the morning was the Illinois delegate breakfast, and this was the same for the RNC and the DNC. So they would meet every morning, have breakfast, and they would have a set of speakers come in to kind of rev up the delegates. And that was the case for both Milwaukee and for Chicago. Obviously, when we were here in Chicago, that included Governor Pritzker. It also included um, the other let's say Democratic heads of the state that would come in. The representatives and senators would come in. Juliana Stratton came in, and I believe that who else did we see there? A lot of union people were there too to speak as well, and then they would have some senators or representatives come in from other states that would speak as well. So we would cover them, and then afterwards they would have press conferences, and then we were able to get with some of the people that had stayed to speak with them. So it was that we would cover that and then turn those into news stories at that point. We also covered over at McCormick Place with everything that was going on over there. They had some workshops there. Sometimes you'd have some special guests that would show up, and if you were lucky, you would grab them. And then everything then would start in the afternoon at the forum, whether it was at the UC or at Fiserv, with the actual convention, so to speak. So as I said, we went back and forth with one of our other reporters. So we would ping pong. I covered the mornings, and then he would cover the evenings, and then we would switch, and he would cover the mornings, I'd cover the evenings. That way, we'd get a good taste of it, and interesting to see both sides of that as well.
Well, so when you say you covered them, what kind of stories do you do and how long were they?
So for WLS, I would call in the morning with Ray and Nick, and we would talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. So I had to be ready to go based on what happened the night before. Also talk about what we're expecting that day. Then when I was on site, I would put news packages together that would air during our newscasts. They were generally about a minute or so, so they weren't all that long, and they would usually include interviews, or like in the case of, as we mentioned, where it was tough to get in. That was a story I did when I was in Milwaukee. I did a story about all the crazy memorabilia that was available, and those would then air during the newscasts. And then we'd also write stories that would appear on the website at WLSAM.com. So I'd write stories as well. And then for our affiliates out of town, the Dallas stations was pretty much the same thing. They wanted a recap of what happened and then what we'd expect happen. Was there anything that was kind of crazy or out of the ordinary? We would talk about that. The two stations that I was on there, one was a news station, the other was more of a news talk station. So the news station was very similar to, say, WBBM. So it was just very kind of straight ahead. Whereas on the news talk, we'd kind of, joke around about some of the things that happened or what have you. And then I also would be with a talk host at night who is on WBAP, and I would be reporting from the UC. And while we're doing those we do live, and he would ask me what's going on, and I we did a ping pong back and forth. Usually that one went 20 to 25 minutes or so.
Wow. So how many live updates did you do? And then
Hmm.
how many recorded? And I mean, were you basically working all day and night?
Yeah, well, yeah, Milwaukee we did. Milwaukee we did. And then when we got to Chicago, we went, wait, we got to figure out how to do this a little differently. You know, it was great. Like I say, Jonathan worked 2 days, then I worked 2.5 days because we overlapped on the middle day. And when we got to Chicago, we said, okay, how are we going to do this a little differently? Especially because we're all at home now. It was there. We were staying in a hotel. It was easier. That's what you were working on. Whereas here it was a little different. So yeah, I mean, in the morning it was at the breakfast and recording all that, and then while the recording's going on, I would generally do the updates with Ray and Nick, and then I would also do them on the two stations out of Dallas. And then during the middle of the day is when I would be on with the Colorado Springs station. It was kind of a midday show that was going on there, and then at night, that was again. Uh, about 8:30, 9 o'clock, I think we would go on, and we're on for about a half hour or so, 20 minutes, something along those lines. And then, yeah, the news stories, I mean, two, three, depending on what you have. A lot of the national stuff, unless it was something that was really interesting, is already pretty much covered by the networks. So we try to get some of the local angles as far as that's concerned. And then, yeah, two, three, four maybe stories to write every day to put on the website. So yeah, there was a lot going on.
Well, when you were on the live shows reporting, being on the air with those people, did you keep it neutral? I mean,
Yes.
were the show's opinion shows and then you kept it neutral? What was it like?
Well, the morning shows were a lot more neutral. The one in the evening, that was definitely more of a an opinion show, but I also pretty much stayed right in the center as well because obviously I'm the reporter, as they say. That's what they were saying. Let's go to a reporter on the scene. So rather than me being like a guest per se, I'm still telling him what's going on, and then I'd let him make up his mind as to how he wants to spin it at that point. And again, always having that in the back of your head that, all right, which role am I playing here? That one seemed closer to being like a co-host, but then you realize at the same time, no, that's not what you're doing. You're there to report on it and give the facts, and then let the anchor then spin it however he wants to spin it.
So you did a lot of music radio for many years. Did that help you be a reporter?
I think so. I think because you learn to be concise. When you've only got 22 seconds to do a bit, if you're outside of morning drive, if you're not a morning show host, and I've never worked as a morning show host on a music radio station, it's always been either middays or afternoons or weekends. So your time is tight. So you learn, you take your material and you learn to filter that down so that you can use what you have and make it the most potent in a very short amount of time. And as you know, working at WBBM, you only have certain amount of time. That also came to me from my many years of working as a traffic reporter. The first part of my career, as well as being like a part-time and a weekend jock on so many stations, was working traffic reports. So B96 on Fox 32. I was one of the first TV traffic reporters, not the first, but one of the first on Channel 5 when we started that in 1991. I wasn't even on camera at that point. You just heard my voice and you saw maps. But if you've only got, um, 30 seconds to get all of that traffic information, well, you need to distill that down and go, okay, what is the most important here? And bring that to the forefront. And I think you learn that same thing in putting a news package together or realizing that you're on the clock here. You don't have all day. So you got to get to the hot stuff first, or you get to whatever the anchor or the show host wants first. So you bring that to the front. And then if you have something else to add, I mean, I can tell you, Margaret, I'd have pages and pages of notes that I would take every day, and I probably would only get through the first half page because we just simply didn't have time for it. But I had that information available so that if I was asked about it, I can answer it.
Hmm. Well, yeah, would you advise people if they have to do reporting, would you advise them to have all those notes ready? Because actually it's very, very hard to go live. So what's your recommendation for that?
I would say that is the case. And I've seen it on the other side too, where filling in the morning show, and we would have some of our ABC correspondents on and people that you know from ABC News, and they would be talking about a specific subject, which they've done a story on, and they don't know what questions you're going to ask. Now, obviously, there are some guests that you have on that will send you suggested questions, which is always good for both sides because if maybe you don't know enough on the topic, at least you have some questions and can kind of go from there. And at the same time, the person that is answering the questions knows what's coming at them. But it is the same thing, research and being ready, because the last thing you want, and I've had it happen to me early in my career where I was asked questions about something, and if you don't, you can't say I don't know, so we're working on it. That's not the answer that the host wants in that case. So if you legitimately don't know because it's not in your research or it's something you don't have an answer for example, at the DNC, we did not always know the lineup until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, whereas the RNC, we had the lineups pretty much set for every day. We knew who was going to be coming on, other than some of the main guests. But some of the others we did not know at the DNC. So to go on with Ray and Nick and they'll ask, well, who's coming up tonight? And I say, we don't know because they haven't released that yet. But it's not because I didn't know, it's because we were not given that information.
Hmm. So when you are at an event, how do you know what notes to take? Do you just take everything you can? How does that work?
I think you have to know your audience and know what's relevant or what is unusual. You have to know your host. When you start working with hosts and you know what they're going to ask you about, or you see something that they're going to be interested in, you make sure you take that down. And as you know, not everything is notes on paper. I mean, you keep some of the notes up here as well. But if you need to quote something specifically, it's probably better to have notes. I would rather write notes, but I don't write everything. And we are in the electronic age now where if you missed something or whatever, there's plenty of places to find it. But if you're there firsthand for something along those lines, especially like when we were doing the delegate breakfast, because those were reported on, but I mean they're not reported on with the same intensity that being there that evening at the convention is. I mean, you've got every network following it. Everybody's got a video feed. In the mornings, we have cameras from all of the major TV stations that are there, and plenty of even some print was still there as well. My friends from the Daily Herald were there, and several from downstate as well. They obviously take a lot more notes because they're having to write something. But I think everyone's style is different. But you have to remember your audience, number one, and this goes for really any type of broadcasting, whether you're a talk host, whether you're a music host. Uh, you need to know your audience and you need to be prepared. And you need to know your host if you are not the host. If you're the person that is answering to the host, know what they're looking for and have an idea of how their style is, because you can bring them something that's unique that maybe the other stations don't. There were several times where I would bring something that was kind of off the wall or something. I can't come up with a example right off the bat, but I mean, and they would appreciate that. It may only have lasted on the air for 10 seconds or so, but if it was something that was a little different, at least you're bringing that and bringing it to the audience as well. Because that's in the end what you're trying to do is you're trying to be the eyes and ears for the people that are listening because they can't be there.
Yeah. Now, how do you speak spontaneously on the air? You've done it for many years. So how did you learn how to do that?
I think it came from my dad. My dad, I'm the only person in our family that's ever been in broadcasting. My mom was a nurse. My dad worked in elevator construction and repair. He actually put the elevators into Sears Tower, into the First National Bank, which is now known as Chase Tower, and several others. So he worked in maintenance and construction and repair
Was he
of
with Otis by
elevators.
any chance?
No, that was the
Okay.
one he was not with. My grandfather was. So there was
Uh,
actually, it's kind of interesting because my family had a bit of a history in elevators. My grandfather worked for Otis, And my dad worked for Westinghouse when that was an elevator company, and several others, Montgomery and Dover, and so on and so forth. And then when my parents were divorced and both of them were remarried, my mom's husband ended up getting into elevators as well. Actually, he worked, strangely enough, he worked at maintenance for elevators in the projects at Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor Homes, which the stories he told about that, very, very scary. But they didn't mess with the elevator guys because that was their lifeblood. So they're going to let them come in and fix it. But some of the stories he would tell. So, but my dad was a talker. He'd talk to everybody. When he retired, he'd be walking down the street talking to the neighbors and everything like that. That's just how it is. So maybe that's where I got the gift of gab. I'm not really sure. I talk a lot, but then there's plenty of times when I don't have a lot to say at all. So I mean, I think that's that way for everyone.
But on the air, for instance, I find it hard to, especially when you're reporting a quick news story. And that's something that is learned through experience. But how did you learn how to speak so quickly and with the main points, et cetera, when you did traffic and news?
I think that's through others that came before, people that I had as mentors, whether they were in the news department or a lot of it was learning by example and going, and when you realize that the clock is ticking, especially in traffic. I think that's where a lot of that, I spent many years flying as well. Not actually flying the aircraft, but I mean flying in a helicopter and a fixed wing. And when you only have a few minutes within that traffic report. So let's say on BBM, where I did traffic many, many years from the aircraft during the middle of the day. So you've got a reporter who's only got 60 seconds to begin with, and I'm out covering the construction on the tri-state tollway and they throw it to me. I realize you have to be aware, we are slaves to the clock. I mean, the clock is all important in broadcasting. And when you understand that he only has so much time, he or she, and that you are within their report. You got to get in and out. And I've had the opposite happen where I've been the anchor and I've thrown it to somebody and they go way too long. And then you have an assignment editor or somebody call and chew you out and say, all right, you had a minute and you went a minute 47. We can't have that. So you learn that way as well, that you have to keep that down. And then that's going to trickle down. I'm going to send a message up to the aircraft, say, listen, great report, but way too long. I need you out in 15 seconds. So you better distill that information down because we got to get to the next element.
Hmm. And what's flying like when you were in the aircraft?
Oh, I loved it. It was great. I mean, people pay for that. I see when I'm down at Navy Pier or whatever, you see the helicopter going over, and I got to do that and get paid for it, which was great. There are some days that weren't as great as others. So, I mean, especially in the winter. So when you're flying in a Bell Jet Ranger, when I was doing traffic for stations like WMAQ radio back in the day, now the Score, or some of the FM stations like 103.5, depending on the format it was at the time, whether it was WFYR or the Blaze or Rock 103.5, whatever. Um, it's that's flying in luxury. When you're flying in a Cessna 172 single engine fixed wing plane, it's kind of the difference of being in a nice SUV as opposed to being like in an economy car. But it's still pretty unbelievable to do that every day. I've video that I took back in the day, brought the video camera up and took some shots. I was with George Offman for many hours, several times, as we circled over Grant Park doing coverage for the Bulls rallies after the Bulls had won their championships. And we would just circle around and around and around and around. And George would report for the Score. And I was on WBBM at that point. I've seen many, many traffic jam ups, snarl ups, accidents, you name it, rollovers. And I actually reported one time on CNN there was an accident involving the South Shore trains over in Northwest Indiana. There was what was called a Gauntlet Bridge. So two tracks. Imagine you have two tracks on both sides, and then it approaches a bridge where it goes down to a single track. Well, something happened with the signals, or somebody ignored a signal, and the two trains ended up hitting head on, and there was injuries and fatalities. So at that point, I not only covered it from a traffic perspective, but I also had to cover it as a news story as well. And, we hear that nowadays as well when, say, even at WBBM, when Bo Duran is on and there is some sort of a news angle to traffic, or back when the great Chris Habermill was up all the time and covering all kinds of traffic and news incidents. And somebody that I worked with from the very beginning, it was his first job in radio, was Mike Lorber. And Mike Lorber worked together for many, many years. And now he's in Sky 5 all the time, covering not only traffic, but news. So, again, that's where you learn shortcuts as far as shorthand is concerned, because you're not going to write everything out. You develop a system of how you are going to report on what you're going to talk about by just writing it into shorthand in the reporter's notebooks. I know you know what those are, but to explain them, that it's just a notepad, but it's long. It's um, so that you can continue to write your notes and then you go to the next page. So I would write in those, and then that's what I would use as far as my notes are concerned. So you don't have time to sit there and write that out longhand. You have to look at what you see, and then take that and somewhere up here and on your notes, turn that into something that makes sense.
Hmm. Well, you did mention doing just traffic and then doing traffic for news. So what's the difference?
That is interesting, because you don't always, at that point, you didn't always have access to everything up there. We're talking pre-internet, or internet was very in its infancy. So, smartphones, you didn't have smartphones that back then. We were still carrying pagers. We're talking in the early to mid 90s. So yeah, you're still carrying a pager, and that's how you were getting your information. You would have to call down on a two-way to the newsroom or to the traffic center to get information. So while you're seeing what's going on, you can report on that, and maybe you can report on the traffic perspective and how that is affecting whatever it is has happened. But at that point, you really rely on your newsroom to give you more details. And it also is at the discretion of the assignment editor and also the news director at that point as to how much information they want you to bring, because maybe they have a reporter on the scene, or maybe somebody back at the station is going to give more information. So it changes based on whatever the story is. But it usually will start, if it's a situation like that that involves, let's say, trains or buses or what have you, or even thankfully I've never had a situation to see a plane crash. But obviously, if you're the eyes in the skies, you're the one that's going to start from there, and then it just depends on what they want. So like when I had done the CNN update on that train crash, they just wanted to get an idea what was going on. The news department sent me up some information. Plus, you're also listening to the station all the time anyway. So you're hearing what's going on, and then you can take notes on that if you feel you need more information. So it always goes back to just making sure that you're really informed as to what you may need, whether you use it or you don't use it.
Hmm. And with CNN, were you actually on the video air, or was it just your audio, or how was
No, it was
it?
just audio back in those days. So when I got to when I moved from Channel 5 to Fox 32, we still didn't have a camera in the studio initially, because I would work in the studio, and then they ended up switching to helicopter traffic. And at that point, they did have cameras in there. So, but at that point, they changed anchors as well. They actually brought in an anchor from Fox to do it. But I did do some fill in, and it is completely different as opposed to just sitting there where, you could be, dressed whatever. Whereas, yeah, now you have to have a nice shirt and a tie on, and look nice. And again, we're talking the 90s. Maybe that's changed a little bit now, but you'd have a camera in front of you, you'd have a camera behind you, and then there would be cameras on the helicopter that they would go to as well. So, what I found about TV as opposed to radio is there's a lot of hurry up and wait. So, depending if a segment goes long, or if there's something else they have to cover, you may not go on. You may stand there waiting to go. There was times when I was filling in and we couldn't fly because of weather, and we would just set up on the side of an expressway or something like that. And they'd say, "All right, we're going to go here in in 2 minutes, so you're ready to go." And you're getting yourself and make sure everything's fine, all that. And then you're standing there, and then in your IFB they say, well, we had to go past you. So yeah, they said, no, we're not going this time." And it's like, all right. Then you go back and sit in the van and wait for the next one. So a lot different than radio. So that's what I call it. There's a lot of hurry up and wait because
And you were saying that you were
you
filling in just for traffic, or what were you filling in
yeah, just
for?
for traffic. It was just for traffic back in those days. Yeah.
Well, but
Yeah,
that's the thing about the
I didn't really have any news aspirations until later in my time at Metro Networks when I started doing the news and traffic on WLS, and then I started doing a little bit of that on some other stations. I got to work with a great news director, Steve Scott at WLS, who's now in New York City, and unfortunately was just one of the casualties at WCBS, them changing formats to all sports. But he was great as well because again, the situation is that you had access to all your wire services, but you still only had, let's say, a minute and a half. So you had to get in, get out, and get on with it, and get to the next thing. So you learn to write more than you need and use what you had. Whereas nowadays, I mean, at WLS, we use a system called News Boss. Most news and news talk stations use News Boss. It's a program where you write your stories in there, and it'll roughly time everything out for you, and it plays all your audio cuts from there. And they have a prompter setting on there, so it's big letters, which is always good for me because I have a hard time seeing things every now and then. I got to put the glasses on to see. So, but it's great because it's a time saver. So, but we didn't always have that. We were still writing in Metro Source, which was a proprietary system that Metro Networks had, or we're just writing in Microsoft Word or something like that. So you got to kind of time out in your head, or you'd kind of read your newscasts to yourself before you go on and see where you end up. But as time goes on, when you do those, you kind of understand. You get a feeling of how long it's going to take. Same in music radio, talking up songs, talking up the intros of the songs. That becomes an art. They call it talking, hitting the post. Whereas you talk and then the last word you say is as the singer starts to sing. It was big in the 60s and 70s. And I had a program director once tell me that the only person that wants to hear me hit the post is me. And I believe he was correct, but it's still an art form, and if you only have so much time, you're going to take as much as you have available. So there's some program directors that don't want you to do that. Of course, it depends on the format of the station. If you're a classic rock station, you generally don't talk over the beginnings of the songs. I remember Mitch Michaels telling me once, he goes, "I don't talk over the beginnings of the songs. I respect the music." And I'm like, what?
Uh,
I go, does the music respect us? I don't care. It doesn't. But I mean, and let's say, for example, XRT. You're not going to hear them talking over the beginnings of songs. That's not what they do. So again, it goes back to the format of the station, and everything's different. So it's what's the rules of the road when you walk in? What's the rules of the road? Because you can't always assume and that it's going to be the same everywhere. And even in the case of being a traffic reporter, when you're on 4 or 5 stations within the same time period, um, your delivery is going to be different, and what you do is different. Like I said, I worked on Fox 32 in the morning. But I also was on B96 with Eddie and Jobo at the same time. So the delivery I did with them was completely different than what I did with Bob and Marianne.
hmm. Wow. Yeah. So how did you switch it up? What was the difference? Because people don't necessarily know these people that you're talking about.
So, Eddie and Jobo, who was a longtime morning show at B96, and the ones that followed them. They were wacky and a little bit controversial. So you could kind of get away with that stuff. If you were on the rock station, the hard rock station, which at the time was 1035 The Blaze, they didn't really care about traffic information. So the traffic reporter, Tom Johnson, who was on every morning and afternoon, I mean, he'd make it more like a bit, some of the things, he'd say, it's like the tri-state's a time-sucking abyss, and there's an hour and a half of your life you're not getting back. You might as well just pull over and weep quietly in your car. Whereas if you're on BBM or a news station, you can't say that. That's not going to go over. So you have to, again, it goes back to knowing your audience and knowing your format and being able to shift gears when you need to. When you're on TV, it was the same thing back in those days. It's like, yeah, you give the information. Then if Bob Surratt or Marianne Marciana or whoever the host at the station is asks you something or takes you out of that zone for something else, then you can move over there. It's kind of like moving in between rooms, but those you keep pretty straightforward.
Okay, now I have some questions coming in from JV
Uh-oh,
Media
viewer
Guy.
mail.
Yeah, JV Media Guy. Okay, hi Scott. Not sure if this topic has been covered yet. What is your view about the future of news radio, especially with WCBS shutting down and WINS being the sole all news station in New York?
Well, that's interesting, and I don't feel that I can speak to it as well as maybe some of the people who did news in news and talk every day, like say a
Okay,
Steve
so
Scott. But I
okay,
will
so let
say,
me. Well, no, actually, okay. Well, before you say, because then I'll. Here's a follow up. Do you think
okay,
other stations across the country might make the shift? Do you think it might create an opening?
I
Like,
I
for
think
instance,
there's always
maybe
for
for
more
other
news.
stations to take advantage,
Sure,
more FM news
yeah.
stations.
Well, we've seen a little bit of that as well. I mean, you have to follow the dollars. That's where it is. Where's the money? And in the case of Odyssey in New York, WCBS was actually a top biller, but for whatever reason, they felt that if they looked at the ratings and then they looked at their budgets, and they realized that if they can have somebody come in that's going to plug in the format, because they keep the station, they haven't sold the radio station, they've just changed the format, and a different company is actually providing the programming. If there's a payday in there for them, that may be the way to look at it. Another good example is EMF, the Christian broadcaster who has been buying stations all across the country for quite some time, including here in Chicago, the Loop. I mean, they changed 97.9 to the Christian format there, and some of these broadcasters with where they're at financially, we're not going to turn down that money to either sell the station or lease it to somebody else. So I think it's case by case. I don't know if it's too early to tell, but in Chicago, I mean, we lost WMAQ almost the same way, where you had two news stations. They were at one point competing radio stations. They were then owned by the same company. That was Group W, and that became Infinity and CBS after that point. And they wanted to move their sports format to a high-powered signal at 670, so they forsake the news operation, and WBBM was left. Now, some of the MAQ staffers went to BBM. I mean, some of them went to other stations as well. Our Bill Cameron came from WMAQ. He was there for many, many years. So, it I don't. It's hard to put a crystal ball on that. And when you look at some of the smaller markets, they really rely on those stations because maybe they don't have as much access to, let's say here in Chicago, where you still have a lot of news services, whether it's television stations or the radio stations that provide news on their websites. If you're in the middle of Iowa or Idaho, even, you don't have as many options. So the local is pretty important, but their overhead might be lower too.
Okay, but then what do you think about, do you think it's possible, for there to be still a shift in radio? Because you were talking about the heyday, which actually I want to ask you about, but do you think that what do you think about the news situation?
It's interesting. I don't know what to think of it yet. I mean, at WLS, I'm still just a part-time employee. I'm part-time and fill in. I'm hoping that eventually they will find a place for me there. So that's my main focus, is returning to some sort of full-time work. But I enjoy every second I'm there, and I think they feel the same. So we just have to see the economy get a little better too. So because we don't want to work for free. There's
Right.
times I would think about it, but it doesn't help when the bank calls asking for a mortgage. So um
Mm.
it that is a big question, and I don't know that I can really give a real concise answer about it. But I mean, the business is not what it used to be, and unfortunately, we need to continue to come up with ways to stay relevant. I mean, it's still free. It's still, outside of commercials, you don't have to be a subscriber. You can just turn it right on and it's right there. And we do rely on advertisers to pay the bills and pay our salaries.
So you were talking about the heyday. You mentioned that a while ago. And can you just describe what the heyday of radio was like?
Well, radio's been around for well over 100 years, and so there's been
Yes.
several heydays
Right.
early on. And I can speak to this because WLS just celebrated their 100th anniversary. That was April 12th, 1924, when Sears Roebuck put them on the air. And if you'd like more information about that, by the way, you can go to WLShistory.com, WLShistory.com. I maintain that site. I wrote a book about the history of WLS, and Sears was a company that during those days really served the farmer. They had the catalog, and the farming community was very important to them. And they had a division called the Sears Roebuck Agricultural Foundation that was set up just to service the farmer, to help the farmer. You have to remember, we're talking the 20s. This was still before we got into the Dust Bowl and the Depression and things along those lines. But they realized that they garnered a lot of sales from farmers. I mean, they were the Amazon of the day when you think about it. If they needed tractors, they got it from Sears. If they needed barns, they sent barn plans and they would be able to build barns, seed, everything. They covered all that stuff. And Sears realized that, well, if we kind of really niche towards the farmer here, that is a great resource for us, not only to help them because they would provide it for free, but then they would provide that goodwill and then people would actually purchase products. So they realized that radio was the up and coming internet of the day, and this is how we could reach them. And they decided to try it on other stations. So they put some programming on other stations in Chicago, and when they realized this was working as they intended, they started their own and got permission from the FCC to put their own radio station on the air. So that started April 12th, 1924. And then going forward from there, Sears only owned the station for several years. They sold in 1928, so it was a little over 4 years, and that was it. Because what they had found is that since they owned their own radio station, they were having a hard time advertising on competing stations because, well, they're like, well, you have your own station. Why do you need to advertise on ours? And they weren't a broadcaster; they're a merchant. So they sold the station to a company called Prairie Farmer Publishing, which was a magazine which is still in print today for the farmer. And that's really when they moved into the forefront of what they were doing, providing farm programming, providing music, news. On Saturday nights, it was the National Barn Dance that was incredibly popular, that lasted from 1924 all the way to 1960. It was on network radio and NBC for many, many years. And Prairie Farmer was very profitable with the radio station and vice versa. They had a lot of synergy between the magazine and the radio station back in those days. And they had a lot of live music on the air and performers that we know from today. Well, not today, but that we know today got their start there. Gene Autry got his start there. Andy Williams worked with his brothers when he was a young kid on WLS. They would sing. The list goes on and on. And in 1960, ABC ended up getting the controlling interest in the radio station. and they determined at that point that they wanted to be a contender in this new top 40 format. So they flipped the station on May 2nd, 1960 to top 40 format, contemporary music, and then brought in all these personalities such as Dick Biondi and Mort Crowley and Sam Holman and so many others who were then followed by the second wave, which would have been Clark Webber and Art Roberts and Ron Riley, which is followed by the third wave, which would have been Chris Eric Stevens and Chuck Buell. And that was followed by the fourth wave, which was brought you John Records Landecker and Bob Surratt and Steve King and Jeff Davis and so on and so forth, all the way till 1989 when the station ended up switching to talk. So there was a lot of heydays. You know, they talk about the golden age of radio. That would have been in the 30s and the 40s because we didn't have television, and what television we had was very, very limited. So the networks that we're familiar with now, ABC, CBS, and NBC, all had their own radio networks. And of course, as we know them now as old time radio shows, those were the radio shows that you heard on your radio stations back in those days. And here in Chicago, the big three, it was WLS that ran NBC Blue programming, which was just a portion of the network. And then that became ABC later on. 670 WMAQ was the NBC Red or the main network for NBC, and then CBS was on WBBM. And there were other networks as well, just like we have nowadays, like with the CW and so on and so forth. You had Mutual, and you had several others. But when TV came in, a lot of those shows, they were dramas and comedies and game shows, and the same thing we see now, all switched over to TV. And then radio's like, oh no, what are we going to do? Because, there's none of that left. And they could not afford to continue to pay musicians to come in and play live most of the time. So that's when they switched to recorded music and kind of brought in the second, heyday, so to speak, with music, whether it was top 40 music or country music, classical music, so on and so forth. And that takes us pretty much up to today. And then talk radio, I mean, that really kind of started um, here and there, patchwork in the 60s. But it was really into the 70s. I mean, the WBBM was late 60s when they switched to all news. WGN had played music for a while, but then kind of went to talk. And then you had stations that were more of a spoken word format, like the old WCFL AM 1000 was owned by the Chicago Federation of Labor. So they had a lot of labor programming on there, but then they also had Blackhawks, and they would run a lot of sports as well. And so that's kind of how all that stuff kind of coalesced together.
Well, now what got you interested in history of radio? Or is it only WLS that you're really into? I know you have that website.
No, I'm interested in everybody's history. I don't know all of them as well as I know that. That's kind of where I focused on. But I mean, I do know quite a bit. I don't know. I've always been a history buff to begin with, a non-radio as well. And I had somebody tell me once that in order to head into the future, you kind of have to know where you came from. And I've always found it fascinating to look into the people that had opened these microphones before us or got this started. And so I think I find that fascinating. And just from a history perspective, American history I find fascinating as well. World history, not so much. I didn't do too well in that in high school, but I just always found that stuff to be interesting.
Hmm. And then but now about radio, like right now we're on the internet, we're streaming live, which live is exciting. Hello. But the thing is that I think that people who are on digital, I don't think they necessarily know how broadcast affected digital. But what's your comment about that? About, how broadcast affected digital, and how do you think that digital has affected broadcasting and affected media in general?
Well, I mean, let's talk about terrestrial radio to begin with. It
Yeah.
has its limits. Okay. If you're on an AM radio station, depending on which one you're on, it has its limits. You're going to have a specific range. You look at the big 50,000 watt radio stations like we have, WBBM, WGN, WLS, and they cover the Midwest during the day. not as well as they used to. A lot of that's because of technology and LED technology and a lot of things that make a lot of noise. Our computers make noise. So sensitivity of the radio receivers are different than they were back when you didn't have all that stuff. But at night, those stations still will cover 38 states and parts of Canada and Mexico as well. Whereas your FM stations, as you know, let's say here in the major market, your major FM radio stations will cover everything from the Wisconsin state line all the way over to Michigan, but you can drive out of range. So, or walk out of range. Some stations, I think I've worked at a few stations where you could walk out of range. So, whereas if you look at say streaming or the component of your radio station, if your radio station has a streaming component, unless it's being geofenced, you can listen to it everywhere. You can listen around the world. I have my own streaming hobby station, and I can listen to mine anywhere that I want because I'm not constricted by a radio frequency signal. So that's where a lot of that's going. And you had mentioned about the future of this business. I mean, we're seeing a lot of stations um, doubling or tripling up their transmitters on one tower now because the land that's under the tower is worth more than sometimes than the radio station, especially when you're in an area like Chicago where you have so many warehouses and developments. We have seen that with the loss of the WBBM site that was in Itasca. We're going to see that here pretty shortly with the AM 1000 site, which is the old WCFL site in Downers Grove. That's going to go away soon. That will be sold to a developer, and those towers will come down. And I understand that 670 may also be the case with their tower site as well in Bloomingdale. So they feel, well, yeah, you can listen on 670 AM or 780 AM or, 95.5 FM, but you can also find us at blah, blah, blah.com and stream live. Of course, the one thing you have to remember, the caveat is that you have to have an internet connection. So, or a cellular connection. And in the times of emergencies or power outages, you don't have access to that, whereas you always had the radio signal. If you think about any disasters or emergencies, whether it be a blackout, whether it's a hurricane, earthquake, something along those lines, the radio has always been there because it's free and it's in the air. And all you need is a transistor radio to bring it down. When we start losing these towers and these actual signals, that is going to be a problem to get information out unless you have a backup generator or a battery or access to the internet. So those are the things that concern me the most is it's yes, you have the reach with the streaming while it's working, but my internet went out earlier this week because the cable got cut and I had to wait for my cable company to come out to fix it. So I had to hoist an antenna in the air to get some TV reception. So
That's
because
old school.
that's right. And actually the quality is really good. The
Mm.
picture quality is fantastic. I don't have an antenna on the roof all the time. So I keep one in the garage and I just put it on a big mast and hoist it up in the air. And that's my engineering background. And there you go. All of a sudden, I was able to watch Me TV, which I don't have on my current cable menu of shows. So actually, that was kind of nice.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's my question is if they're getting rid of all these towers, does terrestrial radio still operate? I don't know engineering.
Well, you have to have a tower or an antenna on top of a tall building in order to transmit, but you don't necessarily have to have a transmitter to stream. So
Right.
yes, which is certainly a benefit as opposed to the past. And working with suburban stations where they don't have the infrastructure that say the downtown stations have, we've been off the air. Maybe the transmitter went down, or I've had where the power went out at the site and the generator is not working properly. And we're off the air as far as on your AM or your FM frequency, but the stream is still going, you know. Or we've had the other issue too, where maybe there was a problem with the internet provider. Even working in a business situation, you're still you're still relying on whether it's Comcast or Metronet or whoever your, your provider is. And if it goes down, then you lose your stream, but if you're still on the air, your programming is still getting out one way or the other, something we didn't actually have in the past. And it's interesting because when I was programming a music station, and if there was a reason that the transmitter went down, I mean, even for maintenance, we've had situations where they've sent tower climbers up there to work on something else, and you have to turn down the power so you don't harm the people that are climbing the tower. um, I would advise our air staff to stay on the air. I sometimes I won't even tell them we're off the air because
Hmm.
they don't need to know that, because the
Right,
stream is still going and people are still listening on the stream. I don't even go, all right, well, I'm going to go to lunch. No, no, we're still on the stream. So yeah,
right.
you keep going. So, so
Well,
yeah,
that's what I'm
so
wondering is like, but when you're talking about these towers coming down, then are these places still going to stream in a terrestrial way, or are they shifting the tower somewhere to another
usually,
tower?
no, usually they are doubling up. They call it diplexing. So in the case of AM 1000, they will diplex with 820 that's out of Joliet. It's the east side of Joliet. So they will share that site, and they can
Um,
send, with technology the way it is, they can send two signals out of the tower at the same time, two or more signals. WBBM, for example, when those towers came down for 780, they diplex with 670 in Bloomingdale. So the score and WBBM come out of the same tower. It's radio magic that they're able to
right.
do that. Involves a
And
lot of filters and cavities and things like that, but it's something that can be done.
well, how did you said for a while you were an engineer? How did you learn the engineering part?
I've always been interested in that. Back in the day, I my dad had a CB radio back in the 70s that so many other people did, so I got interested in that, and then later on took those skills to ham radio, amateur radio. So I'm an amateur radio operator. I've been licensed since 1977, so that does require some electronics acumen, and so I've always found that interesting. And I spent several years when I was back at Metro Networks as what was called the studio supervisor. So I would keep an eye on the equipment and make sure everything is working properly. And if it's not, I would have somebody that I could call, engineering staff, to come in and troubleshoot and fix whatever needed to be fixed. And as I said, home electronics, I've always been interested in that. So that's kind of how I got into that. And when the opportunity was available to go to the engineering side, at first I was like, really? I'm not trained as a chief engineer, but you don't know what you don't know, and you kind of learn on the job. And it's not always an emergency. And I found it a very interesting learning experience. And if I can continue in the engineering side, I'm happy to do so. I enjoyed it a lot, except for the 4 a.m. phone calls when the internet's out at the radio station, or worse, that somebody can't figure out their password to get into a computer, and then the phone rings. That happened.
Oh, wow.
That happens quite a bit. Or there was one time where I worked with there was two engineers that we both worked in tandem, and both had our own stations to take care of. But if one went on vacation or took a day off, you would cover them and they would cover you. And there was a situation once where I literally had to drive to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I live in the southwest suburbs. And it took me about an hour and a half to get there to essentially push a button to put the
Hmm.
station back on the air.
Oh,
So,
wow.
because the internet went down, so we weren't able to get in remotely, and they were off the air, and I got there and you know, push a button, do this, couple things, and that was it. And then I was on my way back home. So it was a very it's a very long evening to push a button. And we don't have any mountains. I talked to engineers that I've worked with in the past. I mean, we're relatively flat lands here. Imagine having to try to scale up a mountain to get to the transmitter site up at the top. You probably saw that when you were in Hollywood. All that's up at the top, right where the Hollywood sign is. So you got to get
Yeah.
up there.
Yeah.
So, and when you get into some of the areas like the Northwest where you've got snow and things like that, there's times that can be pretty tedious. The stories that I've heard from a few engineering friends about, yeah, we wish we were in the flatlands. It'd be a lot easier. I go, yeah, I understand.
Oh, wow. What's it? You said that you like doing engineering. I mean, what's it like being on the air versus doing the behind the scenes? Do you like one better than the other?
No, they're just different. And I'm fortunate enough that I was able to do both. When I went into the engineering side, it was 2019, and I was told by my immediate boss and my engineering boss as well that said, well, just so you know, you're not going to be on the air because you need to focus on this. And I'm like, that's fine. I spent plenty of time in my career on the air. And, I still did some freelance stuff on the side, some voice work and stuff like that. So I figured that'd be fine. And it was all well and good. And then the pandemic hit. And I was responsible for getting 5 radio stations to be able to operate from home. So that took some creative doing, which was kind of fun to try to come up with ways to get this to work that they could actually do their shows or whatever from the comfort of their own homes and dealing with people of different acumen. There's some that were very computer and equipment literate, and then there was others that had no idea, and those are the ones you kind of had to do a little more hand holding. But a lot of the staff would work from home, but a lot of the part timers got furloughed. And I got pressed into service to be back on the air because, well, I was there. So, and that stayed even after the pandemic, that I went back on the air and helped in fill in, and then was working a weekend shift over at the River, which was one of our sister stations as well. And I didn't have to do it, but I enjoyed doing it because it's something a little different. So as long as it didn't get in the way of my main duties, it was fine. So it was kind of nice to be able to do the one side and then do the other side as well. But obviously, I would warn the programming department that just so you know, I really can't do any live work because if we have something that happens or if there's a situation, I don't want to be on the air somewhere and then have to walk away because
Mm.
another station is off the air because that takes priority. So most of it was generally doing voice track work.
Yeah, so do you like live better than recording, or how do you feel about that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is the convenience of being voice tracked. As I always said, as a program director, I told my staff, I said, treat it like a superpower. It can be used for good or evil. In other words, it. Some people say it takes jobs, which is true. But then again, unlike those of us who've been in the business a long time, when I was a young broadcaster and got started, I had to work the weekends. I had to work Christmas Day. I worked Thanksgiving Day. I worked an overnight shift that I didn't really want to work, but they had nobody else to fill in. Whereas now, nobody has to worry about those things as much. It doesn't mean that you don't take care of your shift, because, as I always said, if you're going to voice track a shift, I don't want you doing it more than a day out so that it's relevant, number one. But also, I mean, if we look out today, we got a beautiful day today here with highs in the mid 70s. If I put that on my voice track for today and then it starts to rain or a
Mhm.
thunderstorm or whatever, I'm responsible for fixing that. So there are a few things that go along with that. So yeah, but yeah, there's so many people these days that have never been live, and I'm so surprised at that. My friend and yours, Brian Peck, who Brian and I worked together at Bonneville. Brian was middays on the Mix. I was middays on Windy 100, and we'd hang out quite a bit because we had the same shift. And now he's at WBBM doing traffic. And I never thought I'd hear Brian Peck do traffic, but he does a great job. And I started talking to him about it, and he says, "I love being on the air live." He goes,
Yeah,
that's immediate. And,
yeah.
that is one of the reasons I got into radio, is because, yeah, radio is live and it's local. And Dick Biondi once said, which I think is a great quote from him, that there is nothing more intimate than the sound of my voice in your ear. And
Hmm.
what he meant by that is that we can speak one on one, like just like you and I are, Margaret, where there may be thousands of people listening to you at one time, but you still have to remember to be one on one with your audience. And that goes back to the question you asked me earlier about my influences and the ones that I had mentioned, and why I felt that way is because that's what I felt from them, is that they were speaking to me. If you are out in front of a crowd of thousands of people introducing a band or something like that, well, that's a little different. Now you can, that's a little all-encompassing. But if you're just on the air, you don't think about that. You think about the one person that you're talking to, and that's the most important person, and that's still everybody in that audience.
Yeah. I mean, the good thing about live is, like I watch live DJs on Twitch and I like live because you can see them responding to people and sometimes they're playing certain music and sometimes they're shifting it depending on the feedback. But even just doing live is exciting. That's what makes broadcasting so exciting. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, what's unfortunate, I did talk to somebody who was sort of high up in the radio business, and they were saying that some stations out there, they're they're finding it hard to find talent, on-air talent. And I said, well, it's hard to develop talent because there's all this syndicated stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
There's,
then they said, but they're putting it on because there's not on air. But I'm thinking, but they're not paying. So I don't know what the solution is, but we've sort of lost something by not
yeah.
having a lot of live.
Well, it's kind of the farm system, and that's what we used to have. It's still there to a degree, but it's a little more difficult than it used to be. And quite honestly, being in market number three in Chicago, I've been very fortunate. I've worked in my hometown my whole career, whether it's been in the city or the suburbs. I've never gone to Iowa. I haven't worked in Kansas City or what have you. I've never worked in another market. I never had really an interest to work in another market, but you have to do what you have to do. But what we did have here with our suburban stations is you had that your kind of your farm team there. That's kind of how you got started. That's the way it was for me. I started at a suburban station and worked there for a couple of years part time, and then that led to uh, working in the traffic department, working for the traffic service, and then doing part time work on the downtown stations, and that led to being full time on the air as well. So, that's kind of where your talent came from because, at least they're close by, but if you don't have that anymore. And I also worked with a lot of people that always voice tracked, and they were terrified going live because they couldn't control it then. If you make a mistake, well, you can record again or you can edit that out, which there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, think about what you were listening to. Like you said, you listen to your favorites live. Well, yeah, you're going to have a little flub or you're going to have the human element is there. I do know people that voice track, and if there is a little mistake or flub, they leave it in because that brings the human element and it's not antiseptic. They like to have radio still a little septic, if you will.
But then also the thing about, I remember when voice tracking first really expanded, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh, it's really sad because there's one person going out for six different stations, different markets. They don't necessarily live there." But I'm wondering if people don't care about live, if listeners don't care about live.
I think it's content. I think if it can sound live, they're fine with it. A lot of times they don't know the difference. If it's done well, they don't know. So it's not a matter that they care. I don't think they pay that close attention, but they know when they don't like it. They know when they
Yeah.
don't like the content. Um, and if it's done incorrectly, it doesn't matter whether it's live or on a voice track. They're going to speak with their hands. They're going to change the station. They're going to listen to a different stream. So, um, it really depends on what the format of the radio station is and how it's approached. So it goes back to
Yeah.
the listener because they're the most important part of it.
Yeah, and I was telling the students at Columbia, they're most of them don't listen to radio, broadcast radio, but I was telling them that now with digital, you can put out anything you want and there are no barriers. Whereas before, if you wanted to write, for instance, you had to get approved by an editor, you had to get published, you had to get approved by the Tribune, whatever. So when you're talking about the media before the internet and the hate, all these different heydays, and now, what do you think about digital and content creation?
It's anyone's game now. It goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier and how many of us that got started by playing radio at home, maybe just recording into a tape player or something like that. I look at what we did back then, and we just did it for fun. We just wanted to have fun with it. However, nowadays, with technology being as easy as it is, I mean, look at right here. I'm just talking to you here on my laptop here in the studio.
Right. Your
And
fancy studio where
yes, my
it's
fancy studio
perpetually
behind.
6:20
Yeah,
p.m.
and you may have noticed that the time hasn't changed, so I got to get this clock fixed,
Yeah.
or the one over here. This one needs to be
Yeah.
fixed. But this is what I'm saying: is it's so easy now, whereas in the past you needed so much equipment. I see that from the broadcast side, even the time I've been in, and what it takes to do a remote broadcast, and how much equipment needed to be brought out in the past, whereas nowadays it's a microphone and like one of these guys here, the little I don't think it's going to show up because
Yeah.
it doesn't want to show. There it is. A Zoom.
Mhm.
And that's all you need. And your laptop, it's so much different now than it was. So I think that content creation is a lot different than it was in the past.
Yeah, now you also mentioned a lot of people don't know about CD and ham radio. Can you explain what that was?
Sure. Hold on here. I'm supposed
Okay.
to sign something. I'm signing my documents away.
That's funny.
We we have a little work going on here in the studio, as you can tell.
Well,
All right.
basically, JB Media guy is acknowledging himself, and he's thanking you for the answers to the questions. Or
Well,
I'm thanking JB Media guy. So
oh, thank you, JB. It's not JB Pritzker, is it? Is he
no,
watching us
no.
today?
Although
No.
JB Pritzker did listen, I also do podcasting for the Illinois News Broadcasters Association, and I interviewed one reporter who covered Springfield. And one time he was setting up for the governor, and the governor said, "Hey, that interview you did was really interesting." And I thought, "Oh my gosh, that's the interview I did with him. Wow, that's
hmm
incredible. The governor heard me." So when I walk by his house on Astor, sometimes I wave.
So let me ask you how that feels. How does that feel to know that because we always think of our listeners and our viewers and our streamers and everyone as numbers a lot of times. We look at the numbers, we look at the ratings. Okay, how
Yeah.
well did we do this month, or how well did we do this quarter? Or in the case of your streaming numbers, I'm sure you look at those when you do a stream or you do a podcast. So it's easy to think about the people that are watching or listening to us as a number. So
Mhm.
how does that feel that you have actually put this content together? Because we do it for people watching and listening. Of course, we do it for our own vanity because we like what we do. Back to what we said earlier. But when you think about it, there's a situation where you actually got a response from a listener or a viewer. And how did you feel about that?
That's very cool. It means that people are paying attention and they're nerds enough to stick around and listen to what we're saying.
Yeah. But it gives you a sense of accomplishment because you realize that
Yeah.
what you did is not just earning you a paycheck or earning you the approval of your boss or your program director or whomever it is, that people are actually paying attention to what you're doing and listening and responding, and felt that it was important enough that you needed to know.
Mhm. That's true. But I was gonna get back. So tell us about, I already know about CB and ham radio,
Oh, we were
but
talking
because
about
I'm
that.
older. So
Okay.
but please tell people about that.
Okay, sure. So Citizens Band Radio, that was back in the day, back in the 70s. I mean, they're still around. It started as a communication medium really for taxis and truckers and things along those lines so that they could communicate with each other. And then in the 70s, we had a series of movies came out, Smokey and the Bandit, and a few others where there's Burt Reynolds in his Firebird and he's got his CB and he's talking to the other people. And it became a big deal. There was a song called Convoy by C.W. McCall. Barker 19, you got a big convoy. And people went crazy. It was the middle 70s. So it became the social media of what we have today in the 70s, where you had your radio and you'd put a little antenna on your car or your house or whatever, and you could talk to people in the neighborhood. It's like a walkie-talkie, but with a little more power. And this became the social media, whereas everybody would kind of congregate. Whereas today we would congregate in different rooms, or let's say different places on social media, Facebook or whatever. Whereas there you would just go from one channel to the next. You originally had 23 channels and you had 40 channels. So maybe you hang out on channel 6 and there's all the people you know. So that's how that got started. And then what happened is that it got so crowded and congested because it wasn't very well regulated by the FCC that everything kind of got out of control. At the
Right.
same time, amateur radio goes back to the original days of, like the Marconi days. We're talking, back into the late 1800s, early 1900s, where they would do these experiments. And originally they would use Morse code, which is still, by the way, is still something that is used today.
Really?
Oh, yeah,
Who
absolutely.
uses it?
There's a lot of the amateur operators still will operate in code, in Morse code.
Okay.
Um, but that was for experimenters. So they would build their own radios and they would build their own receivers and transmitters and antennas. And they were kind of the nerdy ones, as you were saying. They're the ones that were the smart ones and the scientists or the hobbyists. And that's kind of how commercial radio got started too. So, but if we bring that up to the 70s, ham radio, it had also kind of followed that same path. Only the difference is you had to be licensed to use it. You had to be licensed to operate it. So you had to take a test from the FCC, and depending on the test that you took, there was varying levels. You would be able to use more power, up to 1,500 watts. So there's hams that actually have more power than some suburban AM radio stations. And then you'd also be given more bandwidth or places that you were able to communicate. And those communications would involve using Morse code. It also would involve voice, television, slow scan TV, fast scan TV, and nowadays digital. So ham radio is just as modern these days as any other appliance that we use, say the internet. You can send emails through the air on amateur radio. So it's pretty amazing. And so we ended up getting into that because CB got so crowded, and we had friends that were amateur radio operators, and they said, "Are you sick of the people just talking over each other and swearing and all this?" And yeah, well, take a listen to this. And we listened to one of the radios that he had, and it was the FM mode, and similar to AM and FM, just like our commercial radio. So it was crystal clear. There was no static, people speaking normally like we are, using their regular names. You didn't have to have, rubber duck or whatever, some crazy handle. I'm Bob, So, and you would be issued a call sign, just like a radio station would be issued a call sign, and got interested in that. And, can operate with a unit which is, the size of a cigarette box or what have you. And with a wire antenna and talk all the way around the world. It's pretty amazing. And so it stayed on the forefront and continues to be. So that I've always been interested in that. And you were mentioning about some of my influences, and I still think that I find it amazing that I can speak to somebody, whether they're across town or across the world, um, on using technology where you can't even see it. It's not even there. It's just this little signal that bounces off the ionosphere and comes back down on the other side. So if you'd like to know more about ham radio, I would say the best place to go is the American Radio Relay League, ARRL. They are the national organization for amateur radio, and you can get some information as far as that's concerned there. But it is not the antiquated old tube sets or whatever. If I had a chance to get up, I could have brought and played show and tell. But you can find all that on the internet. Just YouTube ham radio. You'll find more than I could ever show you. So that's kind of how I got involved in that, and I still enjoy it to this day.
Well, yeah, and also you can't get up because you're in your studio and you're
Yes, I
stuck in a
am.
moment
Right.
of
Yeah,
time.
I think I need to push some of these buttons here too.
Right.
It's backwards
Yeah.
from where I'm looking at it. Yes. By the way, this is the main talk studio here for WLS, WLS AM. Cumulus Chicago is three radio stations, but technically three plus one, I guess. It is WLS AM. It's WLS FM 94.7. Chicago's classic hits. It's Q101, WKQX. And then speaking of streams, we still stream 97.9 The Loop. Cumulus still owns all of the intellectual property to The Loop. So if you go to WLUP.com, you can actually stream the station. And it's also on the HD2 of 101.9 or 101.1. The Q101 HD2 is The Loop. So that is Cumulus Chicago.
Yeah, another thing about you were talking about CB and other kinds of radio before the internet and so forth. But I remember people getting on and then writing down numbers, like they'd communicate with
Hmm.
somebody. And then,
Hmm.
so what is that?
So are you talking about CB or amateur radio?
Um, it's CB. It's when they would
Oh
get like
yeah,
a
so they'd have
postcard
their
and
10 codes. There's like the 10
yeah.
codes, and it's just a shorthand. So like 10-4 was okay. So if you say 10-4, okay. I don't remember a lot of the 10 codes. They were born out of police codes, which and police, fire, and public service. For example, I know that IDOT, we would listen working traffic, we would listen to the IDOT frequencies, the Illinois Department of Transportation. The big trucks that you see, the Minutemen that are out there that go and patrol the expressways and take care of cars that are broken down and what have you. So we would listen to them because that's where we'd get some of our information right away, is listening to their radio feeds. And I do know 1046 was a stall and 1050 was an accident. So CB kind of took a lot of those and then used them themselves as as kind of their shorthand. So yeah, 10-4, and I think 10-7 means you're going off the air, if I remember, and 10-100 means it's a bathroom break. So that's the ones I can remember. I can't remember a lot of the other ones, and I don't know how many of the other ones people actually used. So and CB may have changed. I mean, the last time I was on was like the mid '80s, so it's been a while. I don't even know if people use handles anymore. Where they use a different name or something like that. So I'm not sure if they even still do that kind of stuff.
Hmm. And then also, yeah, you mentioned a while ago, you mentioned a Prairie Farmer magazine. How
Hmm.
are they still print?
Yes, they are still in print, and
Wow.
I think they're online too. And
Mhm.
I believe they're located in Bloomington or Springfield. They're downstate. They're located here in Illinois. So ABC had owned them for the longest time, and now I'm not sure who owns them. But Prairie Farmer Magazine is still printed. It is the oldest farm paper in the United States. So it is probably, I'm sure it's digital as now as well as everything is. But it was founded sometime back in the 1800s. So long before they had purchased WLS in 1928. They had already been around for like 70 years or something like that.
But how do you think they're still able to be print when so many places are not anymore?
Yeah, maybe
Do
farmers
you
don't
know?
have internet as well. Maybe their internet is not as good.
Oh, so but
Until
you
they
don't
get
know from it.
Starlink. Yeah, when they get Starlink, then everything's going to change, right?
Right.
I mean, there's something to be said about actually having a printed book. Do you still buy
Yeah,
printed
well,
books?
right now I'm reading the Elon Musk biography. It's like 600 pages and I'm
Is it
on
a
page
book or is it
400.
digital?
It's a book. It's a regular book.
It's a regular book because it's like I liken it to the renaissance of recorded music to vinyl LPs
Oh yeah.
that is now starting to see its resurgence. As I indicated early on in our interview, I said that when you go back to the '80s, I bought all my 45s and I bought albums too, but 45s were easier. There was only like a buck 25 for a 45 RPM single back in those days. So, if you were to mention Billy Joel, I know Billy Joel was on Columbia, or I think a Survivor, they were on Scotty Brothers, or REO Speedwagon was on Epic, and so on and so forth, because I had all those 45s. So it was a physical medium you could hold in your hand. So you knew it. Whereas, yes, we have digital now, which is very convenient. It sounds okay. And you can make multiple copies of it, whether you're supposed to or not. You can put it on your phone. You can take it everywhere. Whereas, but you don't, the days I heard Elton John once said, it's just not the same. He can remember when he did Goodbye Yellow Brick Road and they made it this, double album and this huge presentation and the artwork and everything because he's a big record collector. I don't know if you know that. Elton John, he will go when he was still on tour. during his days off or during the day or whatever, he would go to record stores. They'd like, oh, Elton John's here or whatever. Sometimes they would let them know, and he would just sit there and produce albums. And I heard an interview with him once where he goes, you can't beat that tactile feeling of being, you buy it, you're anticipating taking it home, and then you get there and you get the wrapper off, and then you look at the liner notes and you read who the musicians are. That's why he said we always put the lyrics and the names of all of our musicians in there because I liked that. Elton saying that he liked that, so he wanted to do that for the fans. Whereas now, yeah, you can download the latest Taylor Swift album, but it's just a file, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think and it's the same with books. I have a Kindle. It's very convenient. I read a good deal of my books on the Kindle, and because you can take it on the plane, you can take it in the car. If you're on the bus or the train, I can continue to read, go on vacation, whatever. I don't have to take a book bag full of books to take. And believe me, I have several books that I haven't read yet that I bought because I just, I haven't taken them with. But there's still something about that feeling of having a real copy of something.
Yeah, I mean, I like physical. I mean, I also read digital, but or I'll go to the library and I'll get stuff. So this Elon Musk, I mean, I'll finish it probably in a couple weeks because it's so long. But now you did mention, I did want to ask you something about Metro News, okay? Because you
Mhm.
said you have done traffic and you have done news, but can you tell me more about Metro News?
So Metro News came out of the Metro Networks umbrella. It was started, I don't know. So Metro Networks, the original form was started in Houston. And in the early days, you had two big players as far as radio traffic were concerned. It was Metro Traffic and Shadow Traffic. Shadow Traffic was based out of Chicago, and Metro was based out of Houston, run by two different individuals here in Chicago. Gary Lee, who's a good friend of mine, was the one that started Shadow Traffic here. And then David Saperstein was the one that started Metro. Actually, he started in Boston, but then moved it to Houston at some point. And in Chicago, back in the late 80s and early 90s, Shadow Traffic owned Chicago. Pretty much every station was a Shadow Traffic affiliate. They had their studios at the observatory in the John Hancock Center up at the top. And Metro had operated all around the country. So Metro was a bigger company overall, but Shadow was bigger here in Chicago. And the story that I was told by several account executives that worked there in the early days, that there was a gentleman's agreement between the two of them that neither one would go into their home market. So Shadow wouldn't go into Houston, Metro wouldn't go into Chicago. Well, one blinked and it was Metro, and they came to Chicago, and then all bets were off. And so that's what started the great traffic wars of the 90s, which was so fun to be at the front lines of. A big day. When I started there, we were in a room about the size of a kitchen, and we had one FM affiliate, English language. That was 103.5, which was WFYR at the time. We had two Spanish affiliates, which was WOJO and WIND, which was Spanish at that point. And then we had printer feeds for Q101, and that was it. We opened at 5 in the morning. We closed at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, depending on traffic conditions. Big day for us is when we were able to provide a printer feed to WBBM, and then it kind of rolled from there. When I was there, I started as a producer at first, and my first on-air traffic report was on 103.5 as a fill-in for the airborne guy. And then we ended up getting the score when the score signed on at AM 820. So Mary Vandeveld was doing traffic on the score at that point, and Dawn Desart was doing traffic. I think Mary was working afternoons and Dawn was working mornings at that point. And then it kind of snowballed from there. We ended up getting Channel 5. That's when I started doing that. We took that one from Shadow, And then, but the big day was when we ended up getting MAQ. When we got WMAQ, where that was traffic 24 hours a day, that was huge. So we had to staff up because we had to have somebody for every 10 minutes on the ones. And that was about 1993 when we got that. And it ping pong back and forth. We would take affiliates, we would lose affiliates, so on and so forth. I had a lot of friends that worked at Shadow, and then some came over. Some went back and forth, and not that different from the heyday with WLS and WCFL, where you had jocks, crossing the river, and they would work at one station, then they'd work over at this one. It went back and forth like that for quite some time. So, and I worked there through 1998, and then that's when I moved into a full-time shift over at 100.3. But the news department was started by our former manager. His name was Jim Sharp. He had come from the Illinois News Network, and he was brought in at Metro not only to run the traffic part, but also to develop a news department nationwide. And he ended up leaving us in Chicago and going to Phoenix and starting the Metro News service there. So they built it from scratch. And since then, Metro and Shadow have folded into each other. They became the same company. It happened when I was not there. And then that got folded into what we now know as Total Traffic Network, which is owned by iHeart. And then some other competitors came along, and no different than any other business. Well, this business became this, or this became that, or radio broadcasters, the same thing. Well, this started as this company and then became that, and they bought this one, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the thumbnail of how it worked. And Metro News, yeah, continues on today, and it's still based out of Phoenix, from what I understand, a part of Total Traffic News and Weather, TTWN is what they
Hmm.
call it. So weather and news, maybe.
And then, but how did you move from traffic to also doing news?
Um, it was a matter of we got WLS as our affiliate, and we did traffic initially. So in the morning, during Don and Roma, Rick Federici, another great friend of mine who's now owner of several stations in Michigan City and in Michigan as well. He was the morning traffic guy on WLS, and Christina Filiaggi was doing afternoons with Rowan Gary, and they decided they wanted to add some news. And so it was a matter of looking around and who was available. That's really kind of how it starts. And who was still in the building at that time of the day in order to do news, because we do news in the evenings as well. Jim Moran was one of the news anchors on WLS, and Tom Bubert was another one that was on WLS in the evenings and did some weekend stuff. So it's the same process of being hired at a radio station. We were asked to put together demo tapes, and they would submit them to the news director. In this case, it was Steve Scott. He would listen to who he liked, and he picked from there. And that's how we ended up doing those, which really is no different from doing the traffic reporting too. Depending on who was in the building, those people would put a demo tape together. I had to put a demo tape together to become the airborne anchor on WBBM. So, and Chris Berry was the news director at that point, and he liked what he heard, and that's how I ended up getting it. And then shortly thereafter, I was on the FM with Eddie and Jobo, because Karen Hand, who was a news anchor and news director in the morning, was also my instructor when I was at Columbia. So I had known her. I had interned there as well. So they were happy with the work I did. So that's when I started that. And Karen's still a great friend and an awesome broadcaster as well.
Yeah, because you're a really good broadcaster too. Because when I heard you filling in for Ray Stevens, I thought, wait, this sounds like Scott. He sounds so smooth. Wait, and then I thought, oh, I should interview him. No, because you have a really nice, and you sound in control because you're saying it's not like that you're always doing talk radio, but it sounded like you really fit in and you were very smooth with your delivery. And perhaps I think maybe you were interviewing somebody, maybe you lost that person. I don't know what happened, but you were good with issues. So.
You got to, yeah, you got to make up. It's kind of like reminds me of American Idol sometimes. If you ever watched American Idol, I'll admit it, I still watch American Idol. I don't know why, but if you're singing your song and you forget lines, you've got to figure out how to cover that as best as you can that people will not notice. And you'd often hear the judges say that. They go, "Hey, we know, we could tell you forgot your line or something happened there, or you got caught up and you lost your place in the song, but you kept it together, and that's what you got
That's
to
good.
do." Yeah.
Yes,
So
yeah.
even though, like I said early on, I mean, I don't get nervous for a lot of things being on the radio anymore. And the nervous part is just because it's something you're unfamiliar with. I think
Mhm.
as human nature is that, we go into situations, and if we're not familiar with it, we're all going to be a little nervous. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think if you weren't nervous, that also shows that maybe you don't care about the product. Maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, if you don't hold that into some sort of you know high, um I don't know where I'm trying to take this, but
Right.
if you care about what you're doing, you're going to be a little nervous until you feel confident that, oh,
Yeah.
I won't say that I have it mastered, but I've got it down that I can do it.
Yeah.
So, and Ray yelled at me beforehand. He says, "Don't screw it up." Well, he used a different word,
Oh,
but
that
I
helps.
won't
Yeah,
use
that
that word,
helps.
even though we're
Right.
on the internet. I think he was just kidding. But I mean,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, that's it because once you're it, I can
Yeah.
remember the first time I had my very first on the air job. I waited and waited and wanted to do that, and it was a music station, and it was overnight because that's where they always started you back in those days. And I was very excited about it until I got to about 2 days out, and then I got really really scared.
Yeah.
I liken it to getting on a roller coaster. Say you go to Great America and you get on the Eagle, and you look at this thing and it's 8 miles high, and you're making your way up, and it's clanking, and you're like, oh no, why did I do this? Why did it? And then you take that first hill and you're like, woo, and then it's all cool. Once you get past that point, then it's great. But I can remember the first air job. I was scared to death. I gave the wrong time my first break, and I botched my own name. So, and I still have that tape, which I will bring out every now and then to stay humble. But
Wow.
yeah, it happens. But once I got through that, I remember sitting there, and I remember I had the microphones there, and I'm like, okay, this, yeah, I like this. But it's that anticipation. It's like a first date. It's like anything. It's like getting married or whatever. It's going to be okay, but sometimes things like that just kind of get in your psyche, and you just kind of plow through it, and then it's fine. There's nothing wrong with a little nervous energy here and there.
Well, how long did it take you to smooth out your delivery?
Um, Overall, when I first started,
Yeah. I mean, well,
so
no,
I
just in
was
general, because you said you were very nervous now, and when I listen to you, you're very smooth. So how long did it take you to smooth out your style and so forth?
So, and that's kind of an interesting question, Margaret, because go back to what we are saying about playing radio. So even up to that point, I was still playing radio at home because it's good practice, right? So
Yeah.
I listened to my stuff that I would do at home. It's like, oh, it's smooth and it sounds great and blah, blah, blah. And then I got to go do it for real. And I was tense,
Yeah.
and I was speaking like this, and it is 15 minutes past 12. And I listened back to them, like, but I was nervous, as what it was. And I hadn't found my comfort zone yet. I didn't find my space. And only being on once a week. So the first 2 weeks I did were overnight, and then my PD was going to move me to afternoons on Sundays. So, but he
Mhm.
wanted to just see what he had. Is this going to work out? So I felt better by the end of that shift. It was a 5-hour shift or 6-hour shift. I think it's midnight to 6. It was like, yeah, so it was a long shift. And then, I recorded it as we do, or we did back in those days, and then you can go back and listen to it. And the next week, it started out the same thing. I was still kind of nervous at the beginning, and then it kind of evened out. And then I think after that, once I got like 4 or 5 shows under my belt, then you could hear the comfort level. It's like you had indicated as well. My wife said the same thing when she heard me filling in for Ray. She says, "Oh, the first day, yeah, you sounded a little uncomfortable. I said, yeah, well, I was. I'm just trying to find my way. I mean,
And
I
it's also like
understand
not
what's
it's not, it's
going
also
on.
not your own show.
Right. Well, that's the other thing too. You have to remember you're in somebody else's house. So
Right.
you don't rearrange the furniture, you know. You can
Right,
sit on the
exactly.
couch. Yeah, but so and you know that's an interesting thing too because there are shows that I've done and there's people I've managed where they'll go on vacation or take a day off and some don't want you to do their stuff, right? You know what I'm saying? If they've got
Yes.
bits or if they got a
Right.
contest or whatever, no, I don't want you to do that. Just do your thing, right? And then there's others, and it depends on the format of the station too. I want you to do this. And I think in the case of filling in for anybody at WLS. It just depends on the show. For example, Ray and Nick, they have their own benchmarks they do, but then there's
Mhm.
other things that we always do, and it doesn't matter who's there. So, you get to those ground rules before you even start, But yeah,
And
you're
also
not going to
sometimes
try to start your own stuff. I mean, that's generally not a good idea. Like you said, it's like, moving your own couch into somebody's house when you're just house sitting.
when also sometimes you don't want to be better than the regular host because then people might say, "Hey, we like that guy better than this other guy." So,
Is that a bad thing?
well, unless they give you your own show. Like if
Right.
they say, "Hey, that guy's
Yeah.
really great. Let's give him a different day part." But yeah.
I
But
believe that has happened before
right,
in this
right.
business at one time or another. Yes, I mean, sure, that's all. There are talents that would never take time off because they were too concerned that somebody else would take over. I mean, I guess that's possible. Um, I
Yeah,
don't know if it's more
a long
possible
time
or
ago I
not
met
now.
yeah, a long time ago I met a news guy and he said that I don't even know if he took vacations or if he rarely took them because he was afraid that somebody would come along and take his job. And I thought, gosh, what does that say about the business? That you're not, that you can be a
Yeah,
great broadcaster and you're afraid of that.
yeah. I mean, whatever's going to happen is going to happen,
Right.
and I've been on both sides of that where, somebody was either let go or, they changed direction or whatever. And then I was brought in, or maybe you had a handful of people in the air staff and only these people were kept and the others were let go. And I've been on the other side of that too, where I was the one that was let go. I mean, it's like drawing the straws and that could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe it depends on where the station's going. Maybe they want it to sound different or you are closely aligned with the format that was there before, or perhaps they want something completely different, or they want to have something that is the same. So, there's no putting a finger on it. I mean, there's a million ways that could always go. And either way, I mean, I think you should be gracious if you're the one that's taken over. And if you're the one that got let go, it's best to just move on, you know? So, because it is a very small business, and you want to stay in the good graces with the people that are involved in hiring you.
Yeah, and I was going to say that we were talking. That's the reason why this live stream was so delayed is because we were talking about a bunch of stuff before going live. But we did cover being management versus being not management. And what can you comment on that?
Um, I've always found that the best managers that I have are ones that have worked in the trenches. I've worked with some people that were simply brought in as people that were, whether they're consultants or things like that, and they didn't quite understand. Not all program directors are on the air anymore. It's always been the
Mhm.
case. I mean, I think of one of the greatest program directors of all time, John Guerin. Look at the staff he had to manage. I mean, talk about
Yeah.
egos. Or look at the Loop. Back in the day when you had Brandmeier and you had Stephen Gary and Danny Bonaducci, and the list goes on and on. Rick Kempfer's book, The Loop Files. Read that book. Great book. And but I mean, so you have to have somebody that is able to steer the ship and kind of keep the cats in order, the herding of the cats. But at the same time, you have to. I think every situation is different. but I think of some of the best programmers and management that I've had. They understand their staff, and it isn't always black and white. It's gray. There's gray areas there in the middle, and you have to take things case by case. So, um, there's plenty of dumb things that I've done in the past and on the air, and I've either been I think one of the best ones, a real quick story, is it was early in my career when I thought I was funnier than I actually was, and made a comment on the air. It wasn't a dirty joke or anything like that, but it was a bit of a double entendre, and I thought it was very humorous. But I didn't read the room. I didn't read the format of the station, which was primarily an older adult contemporary station at the time, and it didn't go on very long. It was very short and to the point. And that next day, I got a call from my program director, and he had pretty much read it back to me word for word, and I just kind of laughed. I go, "Oh, you heard that?" He goes, "No, a client heard it and called the general manager, and then they called me." And he
Wow.
proceeded to run up and down me one side to the other for about 2 or 3 minutes, but and the sweat's coming down. I'm like, oh, this is it. The radio career is over. And like I said, it wasn't necessarily that bad, but it wasn't for that station. So at the end, though, he goes, off the record, pretty funny, but don't do that again. And that
Ugh.
was a sign of a good man. He set the benchmark for me because he realized I gotta I gotta make what I can out of this, and I've got to let him know because he's a young guy. Don't do that. It wasn't the worst thing you could do, but you don't do it here. And it was kind of funny between you and me. So that really set that. And I always tried to, as far as when I was in the programming seat, whether it was a critique or something along those lines, I tried to use the compliment sandwich method, which in other words, if you got something bad to say, Margaret, that break went way too long, and you really should have been out earlier, and make sure that you're getting all of your stuff ready to go before the show. But I got to say, I heard that other one, and it was fantastic, and I like the way you did that. So that way you don't feel so bad. So I tried to offer up the compliment sandwich.
Hmm.
So you got to have the bread that maybe is not that good, but the compliments inside the bread.
Yeah, because I read the Steve Jobs biography by the same guy, and now I'm reading the Musk biography, and they didn't have compliment sandwiches at all. They would completely dress, or I mean, Musk is still working, but they'd completely dress people down. They'd say, "You're an idiot. This is effed up. Get out of here. If you don't want to do it, goodbye." And they became, billionaires or whatever. So I have met some management like that.
Yeah. And I mean, everyone's going to have a different style, sure. And maybe there's some times where there may not a lot of meat on that compliment sandwich, but you try to find something. That was always my style, but and there's sometimes when, yeah, you got to, that it's depending on what the situation is. I mean, yeah, you may have to may involve more stern measures, that is the case too. So it's it goes both ways, but I just think from a day in and day out perspective that none of us like to be critiqued. None of us like to be told we did something wrong. And it's just a matter of the execution. And, the common thread as we go back to it, it's your audience, your employee, your person. They're there for a reason. You hired them because of that reason. So you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater unless it's something that is, completely, off the deep end. You just work with them. And because that's, we should treat people the way we like to be treated. It's not always going to be that way, but you do your best, I guess, is the best way to do it.
But how should people deal with management that they might be nice, but they have certain favorites, and then somebody gets in trouble for certain things that other people don't get in trouble for, or they do worse and they don't get in
Oh
trouble at
boy.
all?
I don't know if I could get into that water. I mean, I don't know. Every situation is different, and it's it's hard to say. I mean, because there's a bunch of ways you could go with that. I think that's more of a a psychologist's question, but
Okay.
I always I'll tell you how I always looked at it. I always just tried to do the best job I could. I tried to be as fair, and if I was getting into a situation that I thought could be potentially dangerous, if you will, um, I just try to avoid it. In other words, it's like, okay, I don't need to go that way, right? It's kind of like it's like the horror movies. Why do they always run towards the person with the chainsaw? Go the other way. We've got a perfectly working car. No, let's go in the garage where he's got the chainsaws, so and you can't always do that, but that's just how it's always worked out for me. I want to make it sound like that I avoid conflict. I'm not a fan of conflict. There's some people that are. I'm not. So I tend to go out of my way to avoid it. But, um, if I've done something right, then I would try to uphold that. If I've done something wrong, I mean, it's best to own up to it. Though, it's easy to subscribe to, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission, but it depends on the
Right.
situation.
Depends on, and well, it depends on the situation. Plus, it depends on the person because
Hmm.
I've seen people get away with a lot of stuff,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
include and
yeah, I
also,
have too. I have too. Yeah.
but
And
also in radio, what I noticed, I wrote a blog post about this, is I call it the hierarchy of personality. So certain people who are high up in the hierarchy, they could either be management or on air or whatever, they can do a lot of egregious things. And because they're just, because they've been placed in the hierarchy, then they can get away with it. But somebody who's lower on the hierarchy, whether it's by design or by choice or somebody they're not favored, then they can get in trouble for something very minor.
well,
And I'm
I
sure you've
would be
seen that over the years.
sure. Oh, absolutely. I would also then start to question their values and their life choices too. In that case, I mean, we're getting deep in the woods there, but again, it doesn't matter if you're in radio or work at a bank or at a fast food place. Everybody comes there trying to get the job done, and some people have other motives than others, and you don't know what they are. And I know plenty of people that have been in toxic situations, and I'm not just talking in broadcast. And you have to determine what's best for you. I know that doesn't sound like much of an answer, but I think you have to determine whether you can tolerate it, it can change it, or you have to walk away from it. I've had that in my professional life. I've had that in my personal life, and it's sometimes hard with family members. You don't pick your family all the time, but sometimes you just kind of have to go, all right, well, this is not worth me getting all stressed out about, and I got to walk away from it. So it's the same situation,
Yeah.
depending. So yeah, so kids, yeah, I guess I don't really have the great advice, but I, seek others. That's probably the best thing to do. Don't be afraid to ask questions no matter what you're doing. Um, I started the engineering side of things. That was one of the pieces of advice because certainly I was concerned about the things that I didn't know. And one of my managers, my regional engineering manager, said, ask a lot of questions. There is no dumb question. The dumb question is the one that you ask afterwards because you didn't ask the question. And sometime in the future, if you're concerned that you feel like you're asking too many questions, someday, somebody is going to come to you and ask you a question, and then that's your payback. So there's nothing wrong with asking questions. I mean, at least you know what your answer is going to be.
Okay, my question now, it's really for the INBA, Illinois News Broadcasters Association, because I want to ask you about the news part, but when back to Metro, I know we're skipping around, but back to Metro, okay, because I did
Hmm.
ask you about Metro earlier. And when you were doing news, how did you write the news for Metro?
So we had wire services. So we would write from wire services. Yeah, I mean we didn't really the internet was there, but it was very in its infancy at that point. So we tended to write from wire services. Um, since WLS was our affiliate at the time, I know Steve would send over some story leads, whether it came from the local leads, maybe the Stingwire or from local AP that we didn't have, but being that
And sorry, Stingwire is Sun Times, right?
sometimes, yeah, sometimes News Group, which is still going. But there was the Chicago News Bureau at that point. I maybe that might not be the right name, but so we would gather all this information, and then I mean, it was just a matter of sometimes they would suggest um, news leads, which way to go. Other times they wouldn't. Same these days. We move our stories around as we write them. If something's hot, if something's a big story, being especially right now, we're in the political season, so that generally tops things. But obviously, if you've got a heavy local story, I was on the air when the Key Bridge collapsed, so that took all morning. That was the lead all
Can you
morning
just
when
talk
I
about
was
that?
on the
What
air.
was that story?
That was when the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed in Baltimore when the freighter hit it. I was filling in for Nick Gale on the Steve Cochran show that morning, and I literally am in the newsroom and I look up at the monitor, and it had just happened, and it was on I don't know, CNN or Fox or where it was on, but it's like it literally just went down an hour ago. So, and I hadn't even done the first newscast yet. So I had to throw out my lead, which may have been, maybe a crime story or could have been a political story at that point, and that was it. So I had access to Westwood One and ABC and Associated Press. So, and then obviously we have all the TVs on, so you can monitor that, see what's going on, and that became the main story. And there again, Steve Cochran, a great broadcaster, and he's going to ask you questions. So you
That's
better
true.
be ready to answer the questions. And it doesn't mean that he doesn't know the answer, but when you're on the air as a talk host, you're relying on your others that are with you to also add color and commentary. So even though he may have known the answer, he's going to ask me to bring me in. So that was a big story. But yeah, so I mean, it was various news sources that we used at Metro, and then they had their own wire service as well. So, and believe me, when we were doing those early ones, the newscasts were very, very short. I mean, they were sometimes 30 to 45 seconds. I think the bottom of the hour is a 30-second report. Plus, you also had to get a traffic report in there and a sponsor. So you got a lot to cram in 30 seconds. So you're doing a lot of headlines. And then at the top of the hour, we had a little more time and you could expand on those. But, it's not, say, how it is at WBBM, where you're in a constant news cycle and you have a chance to kind of expand on that, or you're sending it to a reporter in the scene. Those days when we were doing those, I mean, they were bam, 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 get it in, get out, get back to Rush Limbaugh.
Hmm. And then, but with Steve Cochran, I was going to say something about broadcasters because sometimes I think, even as an interviewer, this is similar, this is like me and some other people, is we may know the answers, but we don't want to front load the questions. And I noticed
Hmm.
that too about reporting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because you probably are looking for something specific, and if you're looking for audio or you are looking for something to write the story, um, it's better to have them say it than you say it, right?
Yeah,
You know?
that's true. So
Yeah.
then, so basically you do news on WLS, but you're also doing talk, and do you also do traffic on WLS?
Yeah, news and traffic. So that our package is news headlines, and then we'll do a weather if we're outside of the Weather Channel. The Weather Channel does our weather at the tops of the hours, and then we'll have a traffic report, and we also have bottom of the hour, top of the hour, bottom of the hour, and then we have traffic on the sides as well. So in other words, around 15 to 20, and then 45 to 50, somewhere in there too.
Hmm. Okay, so anything else? Because we've only been talking for 2.5 hours. So anything else?
Oh, see, we must have beat that Ron Gleason that time. So I
I
told
know,
you
because
I
at
could
first I
talk.
thought, well, I was supposed to go to a webinar, and I mean, it was just a webinar just I wanted to go to, and I thought, oh, we'll be out by then. And I thought, ooh, the webinar is going on now, so I guess I'm not going.
Is
But
anybody still watching? Is there anybody still in here
yeah,
anyway?
no.
Is it just the two of us? Yeah,
Well, the
they've
good thing
all.
about doing digital is I could do whatever the heck I want as long as I
Yeah.
pay my bill. So Because it's like this with podcasting too. I'm like, I don't care if I
Yeah.
do 1 hour, 2 hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever feels right. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
there's no editor program director telling me to cut. So
Sure. No, and that's good, you know. It's funny, when I started putting together, so this has been an interesting year for me. So this is probably a good place to wrap it up. It's been an interesting year. It started working in the engineering department, which I really liked very much, and still being on the air. And then in a moment's notice, as it is in any business, but certainly in our business, as we know, that is taken away from you right away. Some people have the opportunity to say goodbye. Other people do not, whether it be their office or on the air. So that part kind of sucked. But at the same time, thanks to associates and friends in this business, not that there was any sort of money exchanged or anything like that, but as we had mentioned, it is a small business, and if you know somebody is available, they do get snatched up pretty quickly because good people are getting harder and harder to find, and that goes for any business. So I was very fortunate to get back over to WLS. I was there, like I said, back in the mid '90s. I was there in 2019 when my hours were cut over at Alpha Media, thanks to the great John Dempsey, who brought me in, the former news director over there. And as I mentioned as well, Stephanie Tishner, the PD at WLS, and Marv Nyron, our market manager. They made me feel welcome right away. And it's been fantastic to be able to do this stuff. Plus, we had the 100th anniversary of WLS, and as most people may or may not know, I've kind of become one of the de facto historians for the radio station. I'm not alone. There's Jeff Davis, who is the station voice and is your voice as well, and was jock at the station back in the heyday. Worked there from about 1973 all the way pretty much into the late 80s. He moved over to the FM. So he is the historian. So, but we work very well together. And then there's Michael Garay, who is the senior technical producer, who's been there back in the days, all the way back to Don Wade and Roma. And he also works on our history and keeps that station together. So all those people involved, we had the 100th anniversary. So this gave me an opportunity and time to actually work on this and actually present some things on the air, off the air, and on the websites, which I may not have had time to if I was still working in engineering. So while that happened, that made that absolutely fantastic. And I've put some things up on the WLS history site. They're also at WLSAM.com, and I've had a blast doing it. And as we mentioned, the DNC and the RNC and all these great opportunities to fill in. So so it's been a mixed bag. I'm still just filling there. I'm hoping that sooner or later something will open up there, or if there's an opportunity somewhere else to work. But I'd certainly like to stay there, and we'll see how that goes as we make our way through the year. But it has been a little difficult, when you lose full-time position, you lose full-time pay, and I can't thank my wife Karen enough for the support. And she has her job, and she's not always she doesn't always come home in a good mood, but she knows that she's kind of carrying the load for right now, and we'll see how all that works out. And I'm getting ready to relaunch my website, scottonair.com, that has some of my air checks and things along those lines up there too. So hopefully we'll see as we head towards the end of the year that something comes out of it. And I got a couple other things I'm trying to work on as well. So we'll see what happens as far as that concerns.
yeah, because I met you. I literally went to your station in Joliet several
Hmm.
years ago, and I thought I didn't even know you, and I thought, wow, this guy's so friendly, and you're extremely talented. And then I told you I heard you on LS, and I thought,
Hmm.
gosh, he sounds so good. There's so many broadcasters that don't sound like that. And you're also passionate about history, which I actually have to ask you about. How did you get
Hmm.
involved with being the WLS historian? And I didn't know that Jeff was still involved.
Oh yeah. Well, he is the original historian, definitely. And it was during our 75th anniversary. when he put this fantastic production together. It was about 6 hours long that chronicled the history of the station. And I thought it was absolutely amazing to hear. I knew all about the days of the rock and roll era, and I knew that prior to that, they were like country or something or farm or, I didn't know exactly what it was. And he had put this together and it was absolutely unbelievable and so comprehensive. And I just found it to be the best thing since sliced bread. And that's when I decided to put the history site together because there really was none at that point. And a lot of that was based on information that Jeff was able to provide me with. And then after that, once the ball got rolling and people saw the site, then I started to hear from past personalities and was able to do some interviews or what have you, and memorabilia and fun stuff like that. So that's how it started. And then the book came years later because nobody had really written one. And my friend Jim Moran, who is a broadcaster, former broadcaster, and put this great book together about the village of Libertyville in the north suburbs where he grew up. And it's the Arcadia books that you see in the bookstores or sometimes in tourist attractions where it's, the history of Route 66, or here's the history of this town, or here's baseball in Chicago or something like that. And he got me a hold of the authors of the book, and I kind of sat on it for a while, and then I started to put it together, and then we got it together by the when we did our first rewind, which was in 2007, where we had all the jocks come back over the Memorial Day weekend and turned it back into a music station for one day, which was amazing to have them all come back and do it. Kipper McGee was one of the founding members of doing that. He was program director at the time at the station. And then we did it in 2008. And so that's kind of how that all kind of rolled. And, once we kind of got into that groove, so we're kind of the keepers of the flame and the purveyors. And I've been very fortunate over the years through the different ownership and management of the station. All of them have been supportive of this, which is great because it's not meant to be. It's meant to be a historical record. It's not meant to be There's no opinion on it. We don't get into that. It's this happened. If something is not quite correct, because as you know, history tends to be sometimes hearsay. Things can be modified. And then once we got to the 100th, I mean, it was natural to be able to do that, and it made me feel good to know that I was there as an employee as well, that I was actually part of the radio station at the same time. So, yeah, it was, and we're still in the 100. We still got till next April. So we'll see if we can make it another 100.
But you're right. I mean, the timing that you joined WLS part-time in the 100th year and you're one of the WLS historians, that is good timing.
Yeah, it's great timing, and
Um,
it's been fantastic. And like I said, the folks at the station have been very appreciative, and we work together as a great team. And as one person said, um, I have forgotten more history than some people actually know. I don't know if that's true. I get older, I got to actually reference some of it. But, the internet has changed so much. Even when I started that website in 99. And, now you have Facebook pages devoted to that or groups and everything like that and so much more. I mean, it's all good. It's a good way to promote it over the Labor Day weekend on rewoundradio.com. Ted Gordon Smucker, who's a friend of mine, and Bill Shannon, among a host of other people, put together this WLSW CFL Rewound, and featured old air checks from CFL and LS. And I mean, all the music, all the commercials, all the newscasts, like you were listening to the radio. And several of the jocks of the era participated as well. And so it's good to keep that alive. And I think it comes down to, like you said, as far as history is concerned, if we don't know our history, we're bound to make the same mistakes over, I think somebody said. But let's say for the people now that you say don't listen to radio, that's a good place for them to reference it and take a listen to it.
yeah, because if anybody who's really into audio should listen to this stuff, just do searches online. You could even go back to the 40s. I remember I played my dad. My dad was around when radio began, basically. And I did play him stuff from his childhood. I found it online, and he was literally crying because he thought he would never hear this stuff again. But even for
Hmm.
people who weren't around back then, it's good to hear. Like for instance, WLS when they had Larry Lujack and so forth. I mean, the bits that you see on TV are similar to what they did, like animal stories, etc.
Yeah. Oh,
So
you're absolutely right.
yeah,
You
and
know
even
that.
um and even that thing with like I was thinking about Steve Dahl and his wife calling in, and there have been other on-air guys who did a similar thing, and I would say they're probably influenced by his style. Is
Oh,
really unique,
absolutely.
but yeah,
Absolutely. It does work that way. I mean, I think we hear that for musicians, and I think
yeah,
we also hear that for entertainers,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, and anything else? This is exactly what I did with Ron Gleason. And then he said, "This is the second time." Okay, so anything else?
I think I have covered just about everything that I can. I'll give you a couple things. So yeah, my website is scottchilders.com. And then the history site is wlshistory.com. The book is called Chicago's WLS Radio. You can find it on the WLS History site. It's on Amazon. It's everywhere there. And I am on, like I said, the Big 89, WLSAM.com when they need me right now. So so
Oh yeah, about
that's that. Yeah.
oh sorry, every time you talk I think about something else because I'm thinking also about doing national versus local media. And by the way, I am putting your links. I put scottchilders.com on the link on there, and I put WLShistory.com. But anything about doing national versus local, I mean, is there a different feeling or
Well, I've never done national per se, so
wait,
I
wait, for
can't
CNN though
say.
you did. For
Oh
CNN
yeah.
though.
I mean, but that was just news reporting. I mean, that wouldn't be any different
Sure.
than like doing the reports for the folks at WBAP in Dallas or the
Right.
station in Colorado Springs, you
Okay.
know. So it's I can't really speak to that because I haven't
Yeah.
really ever
Okay.
done that. But I mean, I think that it depends on your format and what you're doing and how you're covering it, and that I mean, there's a lot of things that have appeal outside of your local area. So
Yeah.
again, it's your audience. It's your audience. We love you, audience.
Okay. So that's good. And then I will stop the live stream right now. And let's see. Okay. And then I will stop the recording right now. And I want to make
Recording,
sure we're not. Yeah,
recording
I want to make
stopped.
sure we're not live streaming anymore. And the thing is like when I end, it's like